Dead America, The Fight for Kansas. Part 2, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. The flat Kansas landscape stretched out ahead of them like it had no intention of ever stopping. The road was a straight gray line cutting through fields of dead grass and empty farmland, and the SUV's engine was the only sound for miles in any direction. Atticus drove with one hand draped over the wheel and his eyes moving between the road and the horizon. The cowboy hat sat low on his brow, shading his face from the glare that bounced off the windshield. The SUV they had taken from the convoy ran smooth enough, the tank close to full, and the road ahead mostly clear of anything that would slow them down. It was different without the others. The bigger group had filled up any vehicle they were in with noise and energy. Buck's crew had a way of turning even a quiet stretch of road into something louder than it needed to be. Chucky running his mouth, Sasha telling him to shut it, Rocky cracking wise from the back, while Buck kept the peace with a look or a word. Even Ingrid, as professional as she was, added to the mix just by being another body in the space. Now it was just three. Gideon rode shotgun, his katana case resting between his legs and leaning against the dash. He sat still, watching the landscape pass with the kind of calm that came from either deep thought or no thought at all. Hard to tell with him. The man had a way of going quiet that didn't feel awkward, just settled. Meat filled the entire back seat, and that was saying something because the SUV wasn't small. His shoulders pressed against both sides of the cabin, and his knees were jammed up against the back of Gideon's seat. He had his pipe wrench across his lap like a security blanket, thick fingers resting on the handle. He hadn't said much since they'd split from the others, which was unusual for a man who could talk about anything from ancient philosophy to motorcycle repair without taking a breath. Atticus glanced in the mirror. "You good back there?" Meat shifted his weight, the whole vehicle rocking slightly. "Define good," he said. "Alive, comfortable, and not thinking about punching through my seat to get more legroom." 2 out of 3, Meat said. Gideon turned to look back at him. "Which 2? Wouldn't you like to know?" Atticus let out a low chuckle and turned his attention back to the road. The silence settled over them again, but it was lighter now, the kind of quiet that happens between people who are getting used to each other's company. They drove south through country that looked the same mile after mile, fields that had been planted before the world fell apart, now overgrown or withered, depending on what had been growing. Farmhouses sitting back from the road, some with curtains still in the windows, some with doors standing open. No movement anywhere, no smoke from chimneys, no vehicles in driveways, no signs that anyone had been through in weeks. "How far to Wichita?" Gideon asked after a while. "We're not going to Wichita," Atticus said. "We're going to Garden Plain, small town just southwest of it." "How far to Garden Plain then?" Atticus ran the numbers in his head. "Depending on the roads, maybe another 100 miles, give or take. But the last 20 or 30 are going to be the problem." "Why's that?" "Wichita and the metro area around it had close to 600,000 people before all this," Atticus said. "Whatever percentage of them turned, that's a lot of creatures wandering around with nowhere to go. The closer you get to the city, the thicker it gets. Garden Plain sits right in the spillover zone." Gideon considered that. And Madison chose that spot on purpose. She did. Bennett's soldiers aren't going to go looking for anybody in a town crawling with ghouls. It's dangerous, but it's smart. Nobody in their right mind would hide there. "Which is exactly why she did," Gideon said. "Now you're getting it." From the back seat, Meat leaned forward between them. "Garden Plain, that's Sedgwick County, right? West side, off Highway 54. Both Atticus and Gideon turned to look at him. Meat shrugged, which in the confined space of the back seat was more like a small earthquake. "What? I looked at maps." "You looked at maps," Atticus repeated. "Back in Seattle, there wasn't a whole lot to do between workouts and card games. The library in our section had a stack of road atlases. I read through the Kansas one a few times." Gideon raised an eyebrow. "A few times?" "3 times, Meat admitted. "Front to back, I've got a good memory for geography. Topography, county lines, highway systems. It's all up here." He tapped his temple with a finger the size of a sausage. "Garden Plain is small, maybe a couple hundred people before all this. Sits on flat ground with nothing around it for miles. One main road through town. Not a lot of places to hide." Atticus stared at him for a long moment in the rearview mirror, then shook his head with a grin. I don't know why anything surprises me about you anymore. I'm a man of many layers, Meat said. Like an onion, Gideon offered. I was going to say like a fine pastry, but sure, onion works too. Atticus settled his hands back on the wheel and let the grin fade as his mind shifted back to the problem ahead. Meat's knowledge of the layout was going to help, but the map only told part of the story. What it couldn't show was how many creatures were between here and there, or what kind of shape Madison was going to be in when they found her. If they found her. He pushed that thought aside. They'd find her. That was the job. Here's what I know from my last trip through here, Atticus said, keeping his voice even. Bennett's people have been spreading out from their strongholds. They've got soldiers and armed civilians running patrols, scouting, doing whatever Bennett tells them to do. Last time I was in Kansas, they were already eyeing Wichita. Not to clear it, but to assess it. The zombie population in that city is something Bennett considers an asset, not a problem. An asset how? Gideon asked. I'm not entirely sure yet. But when a man with soldiers and ambitions starts studying the biggest concentration of creatures in the state instead of avoiding it, that tells you something about how he thinks. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That tells you he's thinking about using them. Atticus nodded slowly. That's my read. The road carried them through another empty stretch. A grain elevator rose up on the left side, towering over a cluster of low buildings that made up what had been a small town. No sign on the road to tell them what it was called. Just empty structures baking in the sun, with weeds pushing up through the cracks in the parking lot. So, what's the plan when we get close? Meat asked. We can't just roll up to a town in the shadow of Wichita and honk the horn. No, we cannot, Atticus agreed. The further south we go, the more creatures we're going to see on the roads. At some point, driving isn't going to be an option. The engine noise pulls them in, and once enough of them start following, you get a trail behind you that just keeps growing. So we go on foot for the last stretch, Gideon said. That's what I'm thinking. We drive as far as we safely can, find some place to stash the SUV where it won't get torn apart, and cover the rest on foot. Quiet, blades only, unless we don't have a choice. Meat looked down at his pipe wrench. Blades, he said flatly. You've got a knife, don't you? I've got a knife. It's just that the wrench has been working pretty well for me. The wrench is loud, Atticus said. In tight quarters with a handful of creatures, it's fine. In a zone where there are hundreds of them wandering around and every sound draws more, it's going to get us killed. Meat didn't argue. He just nodded and leaned back, though the look on his face said he wasn't happy about leaving his favorite tool on the bench. Once we're on foot, Atticus continued, we move cross-country, stay off the roads, stick to cover, and work our way into Garden Plain from the north side. When we get there, we look for signs of her. Madison's trained for this kind of thing. She'll have a position set up somewhere defensible, somewhere she can watch the streets and stay hidden. We just have to find it. And if we can't find it? Gideon asked. Not challenging, just practical. Then we search until we do, Atticus said. Quietly, carefully, and without getting ourselves surrounded. It's a small town. If she's there, we'll find signs of her. And if she's not there? Atticus let that question sit in the air for a second longer than was comfortable. Then we deal with that when we get to it. They drove on in silence for a few miles, each of them processing the plan and the risks that came with it. The landscape didn't change. Flat fields, empty roads, the occasional farmstead, sitting quiet and abandoned off in the distance. Kansas had always been wide open country, and the apocalypse hadn't changed that. If anything, it had made it more so. The emptiness felt bigger now, like the land had swallowed up all the people who used to live on it and just kept going. Gideon broke the silence. How long has she been out here on her own? Atticus thought about it. Since the soldiers hit Grand Bend, a few days at least. She was out on a run when the attack happened, so she wouldn't have gone back to the safe house. She'd have stuck to the plan and headed for Garden Plain. What kind of person are we looking for? Gideon asked. You said she's an agent. What does that mean in practice? It means she's smart, she's tough, and she's been operating undercover in hostile territory for a long time. She doesn't trust people easily, and she's going to be on edge when we find her. If she's been surviving alone in a town full of zombies for days, she's going to be running on fumes. So she might not be thrilled to see 3 strangers walk up to her door, Gideon said. "She's not going to be thrilled to see anybody walk up to her door, but she'll recognize me from before. That should buy us enough time to explain." "Should?" Meat said from the back. "Should," Atticus confirmed. The road curved slightly, following the contour of a creek bed that had dried to a trickle. As they came around the bend, Atticus's eyes caught movement on the highway ahead. He eased off the gas and sat up straighter in the seat. A figure was standing in the road about a quarter-mile out. Then another one, off to the right, shuffling through the grass along the shoulder. A third was visible further back, moving slowly across the open field beyond the ditch. Zombies, scattered and aimless, drifting across the landscape like leaves blown by a wind that had already died. Gideon leaned forward slightly. "More than we've seen since Grand Bend." "Yeah," Atticus said quietly. He kept the SUV moving, but dropped the speed, steering around the first shambler without getting close enough to draw its attention. The creature turned its head as they passed, tracking the sound of the engine, but didn't follow. It just stood there, swaying slightly, watching with vacant eyes as they rolled by. More appeared ahead. 2 more on the road, another group of 4 visible in the field to the left, and several more emerging from a tree line in the distance. Not a horde, not yet, but a clear change from the empty roads they'd been driving all day. "It's starting," Atticus said. Meat shifted in the back seat, his hand tightening on the wrench. Gideon's fingers moved to the latches on his katana case, not opening it, just resting there. The SUV rolled on, weaving slowly through the scattered ghouls on the highway, heading deeper south into territory that was only going to get worse. Chapter 2. The scattered zombies from the end of the last stretch turned into a steady presence within the first 10 miles. Not a flood, not anything close to a horde, but a trickle that never stopped. 1 here, 2 there. A cluster of 4 standing in the middle of a field, like they'd forgotten what they were doing. They dotted the highway and the land on either side of it, shuffling through the grass, drifting along the shoulders, standing motionless in the open, with their heads tilted at angles that no living person would hold. Atticus kept the SUV moving at a steady pace, weaving around the ones on the road without slowing down more than he had to. Most of them didn't react fast enough to be a problem. They'd turn toward the sound of the engine, take a step or 2 in the direction of the vehicle, and then it was past them. A few got close enough to brush the side panels, hands dragging across the metal with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, but none of them managed to get in front of the SUV or hold on. 1 ghoul standing dead center in the lane didn't move at all, just stood there, swaying like the sound of the engine didn't register. Atticus didn't swerve. He dropped the speed, lined up the bumper, and pushed through. The impact was firm, but not violent, the creature folding over the hood and tumbling off the side. It hit the pavement and didn't get up. "That one was checked out," Meat said from the back. "They're all checked out," Atticus said. "Some of them just don't know it yet." They passed through the first town without stopping. It didn't have a name, or if it did, the sign was gone. A handful of buildings huddled along the highway. A gas station with its canopy still standing, a feed store, a church with a steeple that leaned about 10 degrees to the right. The buildings were dark and still. No barricades on the doors, no boards on the windows, no signs that anyone had tried to make a stand here. Whatever population this place had, they were gone. Dead or moved on, it didn't matter which. The result was the same. Zombies wandered through the streets, a dozen or more visible as they rolled past. A few turned their heads to follow the SUV, but none of them gave chase. They just drifted, aimless, like fish in a tank with no glass walls. The second town was the same, a little bigger maybe, with a 2-story building that might have been a school and a row of houses along a side street. Same emptiness, same absence of anything human. Just structures standing in the sun with ghouls moving between them in slow, purposeless loops. "Nobody even tried?" Gideon said quietly, looking out the window as they passed. "Some of these towns only had a few dozen people in them," Atticus said. "My guess is, when the military came through, they either moved them into safer areas, or there was nobody left to move." Gideon didn't respond. He just watched the empty town slide past his window, his jaw set in a way that said he was filing it away somewhere he'd think about later. The third town had a gas station with a fuel tank that looked intact. Atticus slowed the SUV and pulled off the highway onto the cracked lot, rolling to a stop next to the pumps. The canopy overhead provided some shade, and the building itself looked untouched. The door was closed, the windows unbroken. "We should top off while we can," Atticus said, killing the engine. "No telling when we'll get another chance." The silence that followed the engine shutting off was immediate and heavy. No hum, no rumble, just the wind moving across flat ground and, underneath it, the low distant moan of creatures somewhere out of sight. "I'll siphon," Meat said, already reaching for the door handle. "I saw a hose in the back when we loaded up." "I'll keep eyes on the perimeter," Gideon said. Atticus nodded. "I'll check the building. Might be something useful inside." They moved with a quiet efficiency that was starting to feel natural. Meat went to the back of the SUV and dug out the rubber hose in a container they had brought along. He knelt next to one of the underground tank access points, prying the cap free and feeding the hose down. The smell of fuel rose up, sharp and chemical, which meant there was still something worth taking. Gideon stepped out into the lot with his katana drawn, the blade catching the light as he turned a slow circle. The road behind them was clear for now, though 2 zombies were visible about 100 yards east, shuffling along the far side of the highway. A third was standing in the doorway of the feed store across the street, not moving, just standing there, like it was waiting for the store to open. Atticus tried the gas station door. Locked. He used the butt of his knife to pop the latch and stepped inside. The air was stale and hot, the shelves mostly bare. Someone had been through here already, taking the food and water, but leaving behind the things that didn't matter anymore. Motor oil, windshield wiper fluid, a rack of sunglasses, a spinner display of keychains with names on them. He grabbed a couple of bottles of motor oil and a pack of shop rags, then headed back outside. Meat had the hose working, fuel flowing into the container with a steady gurgle. He was on one knee, holding the hose steady and watching the container fill. He looked up when Atticus came out. "Decent amount down there, enough to fill us up and then some." "Good, fill every container we've got. Already on it." Atticus set the oil and rags by the SUV and moved to stand near Gideon, scanning the road and the buildings around them. The town was quiet. The 2 creatures on the highway had moved closer, but were still a good distance off. The one in the feed store doorway hadn't budged. "How long?" Gideon asked without turning. "Few minutes. Meat knows what he's doing." They waited. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of fuel across the lot. Atticus didn't love that. Anything that put a smell into the air was a signal, and they were standing still in an area with an unknown number of ghouls nearby. The first one came around the corner of the gas station building. It shuffled into view from the south side, drawn by something, maybe the fuel smell, maybe the residual engine noise still echoing off the canopy. It was a man, or had been. Tall, wearing what was left of a work shirt and jeans, one arm hanging limp at his side. Its eyes were vacant and its mouth hung open, a low moan rolling out of its throat as it locked onto the 3 of them. "Contact," Gideon said calmly. A second appeared behind it, then a third from the opposite side of the building. 2 more came up from the ditch along the road to the south, climbing the embankment with stiff, clumsy movements. Within 30 seconds, there were 7 of them converging on the gas station lot from 3 different directions. "Meat," Atticus called, keeping his voice low and steady. "We've got company." "I see them," Meat said. He didn't stop siphoning. "Give me 60 seconds. "You've got 30. Gideon moved first. He crossed the lot in long, quiet strides, closing the distance on the nearest zombie before it could react. The katana came up in a smooth arc and took the top of its skull clean off. The creature dropped without a sound. He pivoted, already tracking the second one, and drove the blade through its temple with a short, controlled thrust. 2 down in the time it took to blink. Atticus pulled his knife and went right, cutting off the 2 that had come up from the ditch. The first one reached for him with both hands, fingers grasping at the air. He sidestepped, caught it by the collar of its shirt, and drove the blade into the base of its skull from behind. It went limp, and he let it drop, pulling the knife free and turning to meet the second. This one was faster than it looked, closing the gap with lurching steps. Atticus planted his feet and waited until it was in range, then punched the knife forward into its eye socket. The creature's momentum carried it into him, but he braced and shoved it aside, the body crumpling to the pavement. The last 3 were heading straight for Meat, who had pulled the hose free and was getting to his feet. Gideon got to the first one before it reached him, the katana splitting its skull in a downward strike that barely slowed his stride. The second ghoul stumbled into Meat's path, and Meat met it with his forearm, stiff-arming it back and holding it at arm's length while it snapped and clawed at him. He gripped it by the throat and held it still long enough for Gideon to come around and finish it with a clean cut. The last one came at Meat from the side. He caught it with his free hand, both fists now full of zombie, one dead and one still squirming. He shoved the dead one away and spun the live one around, holding it from behind like a bouncer ejecting a drunk. Atticus stepped in and put the knife through its temple. Meat let the body drop and brushed off his hands. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. 7 zombies, all down, and not a single gunshot. The loudest sound had been the bodies hitting the pavement. Gideon cleaned his blade on the work shirt of the nearest corpse and slid it back into position. That was efficient. Gideon cleaned his blade on the work shirt of the nearest corpse and slid it back into position. That was a nice little workout. Been cooped up in that SUV too long. "Don't overextend yourself," Atticus said, wiping his knife on his jeans. "We got a lot more to cut through before the day is finished." They finished the fueling without further incident, topping off the SUV's tank and filling 2 additional containers that they secured in the back. By the time they pulled out of the lot and back onto the highway, the town was behind them, and the road ahead showed more of what they had already been seeing. Creatures on the highway, ghouls in the fields, zombies drifting out of tree lines in 1s and 2s. The density was climbing, slowly, but it was climbing. Gideon watched the landscape for a while before turning to Atticus. "Tell me about Madison." Atticus glanced at him. "What do you want to know?" "What kind of person she is, what we should expect when we find her." Atticus considered the question, taking his time with the answer. "She's an agent, the real deal, not some desk jockey who got handed a field assignment. She's been operating undercover in Kansas since before things went to hell out here. Then she was put on, keeping an eye on what the military was doing, what Bennett's people were building. She stayed behind when she could have gotten out because the job wasn't done." "That takes a particular kind of person," Gideon said. "It does. She's sharp, quick thinker, good instincts, doesn't rattle easy." Atticus trailed off for a moment before continuing. "Just a heads up, though. She might be pissed at me." "You're saying she might not trust us." "Trust isn't the issue. It's the fact that I said I'd be back with help soon, and it's been weeks. Weeks that haven't really been quiet and uneventful for her." Gideon nodded slowly. "So, we let her set the pace." "That's exactly right. We give her the information, we tell her what's happened, and we let her process it on her terms. She'll come around, but it needs to be her decision. If we push, she'll push back harder." "Sounds like someone I knew in the industry," Gideon said. "Director I worked with on the 3rd Ninja Dominator. Brilliant man, but if you tried to tell him how to shoot a scene, he'd cut you out of the next 3 setups just to prove a point." Atticus cracked a smile. "Something like that, except with higher stakes." "Clearly you've never worked with Hollywood producers who took out a 3rd mortgage on their house to fund the movie," Gideon said. Everybody in the vehicle chuckled, enjoying a brief moment of levity as the situation around them deteriorated. They drove on, the SUV weaving through the increasing scatter of ghouls on the highway. The road stretched south, the horizon flat and unbroken, and somewhere ahead of them, a small town sat in the shadow of a dead city, crawling with creatures. And somewhere inside it, one woman was waiting, whether she knew they were coming or not. Chapter 3. The change came on fast. 1 mile they were weaving through the usual scatter of zombies on the highway, the same pattern they'd been dealing with for hours. The next mile, the scatter became clusters. 3 here, 5 there, a knot of 8 standing in the middle of the road, like they'd been having a conversation and forgot to leave. And beyond the clusters, more were visible in the fields, dozens of them, shuffling through the dead grass in loose groups that stretched out in every direction. Atticus eased off the gas and let the SUV slow to a crawl. His hands tightened on the wheel as he took in the scope of what was ahead of them. "Well," Meat said from the back seat, "that's a lot of ghouls." It was. The highway ahead was dotted with them as far as he could see, dark shapes moving against the flat landscape like ants on a countertop. More were emerging from the tree lines on both sides of the road, drawn by something. The vibration of the engine through the ground, the sound carrying across the open fields. They came out of the trees in ones and twos, joining the growing mass on and around the highway. "I think we've had it as good as we're going to get," Atticus said. "Everything between here and Wichita is going to look like this or worse." Gideon leaned forward, studying the road through the windshield. "How much worse?" "More than we're going to be able to drive through." He guided the SUV around a cluster of 5 zombies standing in the right lane. They turned as the vehicle passed, heads swiveling in unison to track the noise. One of them took a step toward the road, then another. Then all 5 were shambling after the SUV, their pace slow but steady, arms reaching toward the retreating vehicle. Atticus checked the mirror. The 5 were falling behind, but they weren't stopping. They'd follow the sound until it faded, or something else caught their attention. And behind them, the 2 ghouls that had been standing in the field were now on the road too, shuffling in the same direction. "We're picking up a tail," he said. Gideon looked back through the rear window. 7, no, 9, more coming from the left. It was the engine noise. Every second they spent driving was a signal broadcasting in every direction, and every creature within earshot was answering. The ones on the road turned and followed. The ones in the fields changed direction and started drifting toward the highway. The zombies emerging from the tree lines angled their paths to intercept. None of them were fast. None of them were a threat on their own. But they were accumulating. Atticus pushed through another cluster on the road, the SUV bumping over a ghoul that had dropped to its knees in the lane. The impact jarred all 3 of them. Meat braced against the ceiling with one hand. Gideon caught himself on the dash. "Sorry," Atticus said. "Don't apologize," Meat said. "Just don't flip us." They drove another half-mile, and the density jumped again. The road ahead had zombies across both lanes, not shoulder to shoulder, but thick enough that there was no clean line through them. Atticus slowed to walking speed and picked his way between them, the SUV's mirrors nearly brushing the outstretched arms of creatures on either side. The moaning was audible through the closed windows now, a low droning sound that came from every direction at once. Gideon checked the mirror again. "The tail is growing. I can count at least 20 behind us, and more joining from the sides." Atticus nodded. He'd been watching it build. The trailing mass was like a wake behind a boat, spreading wider and longer the further they went. Every creature they passed fell in behind them, and every ghoul that saw the trailing group joined it. The math was simple and ugly. If they kept driving, the trail would keep growing, and if they had to stop for any reason, that trail would catch up. He spotted a break in the fence line on the right side of the road, a dirt path leading to a farmstead, set back about 200 yards from the highway. He turned the wheel and took the path, the SUV bouncing over the rough ground as they left the pavement behind. "Where are we going?" Gideon asked. "Somewhere I can stop for 5 minutes without getting swarmed." The farmstead was a low-slung house with a detached garage and a metal equipment shed. A windmill stood behind the house, its blades still turning in the breeze. The property was fenced on 3 sides, with the dirt path being the only way in from the road. A few zombies were visible on the property, 3 of them wandering near the equipment shed, but the density was far lighter than the highway. Atticus pulled the SUV around to the back of the house, putting the building between them and the road. He killed the engine, and the silence dropped over them like a blanket. The moaning from the highway was still audible, but it was distant now, muffled by the house and the 200 yards of open ground. They sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle. After hours of constant engine noise and the low drone of moaning pressing in through the windows, the stillness felt almost unnatural. The wind pushed through the grass outside, and the windmill creaked with each slow rotation. But beyond that, there was nothing. Just Kansas, sitting empty and still under a sky that didn't care what was happening beneath it. "We need to talk about this," Atticus said. He pulled the road atlas from between the seats and spread it across the steering wheel. Meat leaned forward from the back, his massive frame filling the gap between the 2 front seats. Gideon shifted to get a better angle on the map. "We're here," Atticus said, pointing to a spot on the highway south of their last fuel stop. "Garden Plain is here." He moved his finger southwest, past Wichita, to a small dot on the map. "That's roughly another 30 miles, but the last 15 or 20 are deep in the spillover zone, and what we just drove through is the thin edge of it." "It's only going to get thicker," Meat said. "A lot thicker. We're catching the outer ring right now. creatures that wandered far enough from the city to spread out. Closer in, they'll be packed tighter. Near Garden Plain itself, right in the shadow of Wichita, we could be looking at hundreds per square mile. Gideon studied the map. Can we go around, approach from the west or south, instead of driving straight through the densest part? Atticus traced a couple of alternate routes with his finger. We could swing wide to the west, come down through Cheney and loop around. Adds maybe 40 miles and burns fuel we might need later. And there's no guarantee the density is any better on that approach. Garden Plain sits close to Wichita, no matter which direction you come from. So there's no clean way in, Gideon said. No, there's not. Meat tapped the map with one thick finger. What about the SUV? We keep driving, we keep building that tail. Eventually we hit a stretch where the road is so packed we can't get through. And then we've got a wall of ghouls in front of us and a mob behind us. That's exactly the problem, Atticus said. And even if we do punch through, the SUV is our ride home. If we drive it into something we can't drive it out of, we're walking back to Ellsworth. That's over 100 miles on foot through territory we've already seen is crawling with creatures. The three of them looked at the map in silence for a moment, the weight of the geography settling over them. So, when do we switch to foot? Gideon asked. Atticus studied the map, running distances in his head. We push as far south as we can while the road is still passable. When the density gets to the point where we're spending more time dodging creatures than making progress, we find a place to stash the SUV, somewhere solid, enclosed, where the zombies can't get to it. A barn, a garage, something with walls and a door we can close. And then we walk, Meat said. And then we walk, 5 miles, maybe more, depending on where we stash it. Through fields and back roads, staying off the highway where the density is highest. Meat looked out the window at the flat, open landscape. 5 miles through that, he said, on foot, with nothing but blades. That's the job, Atticus said, just making sure we're all on the same page. We're on the same page, Gideon said. He said it calmly, the way a man does when he's made a decision and isn't interested in revisiting it. We drive until we can't. We stash the vehicle, and we go in quiet. Find Madison, get what we came for, and get back to the SUV. Atticus folded the atlas and tucked it back between the seats. That's the plan. Simple enough to say. Getting it done is the hard part. Always is, Gideon said. Atticus started the engine. The sound seemed louder than before, or he was just more aware of it now, knowing what it attracted. He pulled the SUV back around the house and onto the dirt path, heading for the highway. The 3 zombies near the equipment shed had moved closer, drawn by the brief engine noise from when they'd arrived. One of them was standing directly in the path. Atticus didn't slow down. The bumper caught it at the knees, and it went under without much fuss. They hit the highway and turned south. The trailing mass from before had dispersed somewhat, the ghouls spreading back out across the road and fields now that the sound source had been gone for a few minutes. But as soon as the SUV's engine hit the air again, heads turned, bodies pivoted. The slow convergence started all over. Atticus pressed the accelerator and pushed deeper into the outer ring. The density climbed with every mile. Clusters became crowds. The spaces between groups of ghouls shrank. Creatures filled the road in greater numbers, forcing Atticus to weave constantly. The SUV rocking and bumping as he navigated through gaps that were getting narrower. More emerged from the tree lines, from the fields, from the ditches along the road. They came from everywhere, drawn by the sound, closing in from all sides in that slow, relentless way that made the math impossible to ignore. The moaning grew louder. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was a wall of sound, low and constant, rolling across the flat landscape from every direction. Hundreds of voices, none of them human, all of them hungry. A zombie stumbled into the path of the SUV, and Atticus clipped it with the front quarter panel, sending it spinning into the ditch. 2 more stepped into the gap it left. He threaded between them with inches to spare, the side mirrors nearly touching dead flesh on both sides. Gideon's hand rested on his sword case. Meat's fingers were wrapped around the handle of his pipe wrench. Neither of them spoke. Atticus drove on, eyes moving, hands steady on the wheel, guiding the SUV deeper south into territory that was only going to get worse before it got better. If it got better at all. Chapter 4. Atticus almost missed it. He was focused on the road ahead, threading the SUV between a pair of ghouls that had drifted into the lane, when Gideon said, "Stop." The word was calm but firm, and Atticus trusted it enough to hit the brakes without asking why. The SUV slowed to a crawl, and Gideon pointed to a side road branching off the highway to the left. It was a narrow two-lane that ran east between open fields, the kind of road that connected one small town to another without bothering to be anything more than pavement and a center line. What caught Gideon's eye wasn't the road itself, it was what was on it. About 50 yards down the side road, a pair of sawhorses sat at angles across the lanes. They were the heavy-duty kind, painted orange and white, the type you'd see at construction sites or police roadblocks. Behind them, a stack of sandbags had been arranged in a low wall, maybe 3 feet high, running across half the road. And beyond the sandbags, the dark shapes of 2 dead zombies lay crumpled on the pavement. "That's not random," Gideon said. "No, it's not," Atticus agreed. He turned the SUV onto the side road and rolled slowly toward the checkpoint. A few creatures were visible in the fields on either side, but none were close enough to be a problem. The moaning from the highway faded behind them as they left the main road. Atticus stopped the SUV about 20 yards from the sawhorses and killed the engine. The 3 of them sat for a moment, scanning the area before anyone opened a door. The checkpoint was silent. No movement behind the sandbags, no vehicles, no people. Just the sawhorses, the sandbags, and the 2 dead ghouls lying in the road. "I'll take a look," Atticus said. "Stay with the vehicle." "I'll keep eyes on the fields," Gideon said, stepping out with his sword. Meat stayed in the SUV with the windows cracked, his wrench across his lap and his head on a swivel. Atticus approached the checkpoint on foot, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The closer he got, the more details came into focus. The sawhorses had been placed deliberately, positioned to funnel traffic into a single lane on the right side of the road. The sandbag wall was a firing position, built low enough to shoot from a kneeling position while staying behind cover. Someone with military training had set this up. The placement was too clean, too purposeful for anything else. He stepped around the sawhorses and knelt next to the first dead zombie. It was face down on the pavement, a neat hole punched through the back of its skull. The blood around the wound was dark and tacky, not fully dried. He touched the edge of the stain with his fingertip. Still slightly damp. This creature had been put down recently. A day, maybe 2 at the outside. The second ghoul lay a few feet away, sprawled on its back with a bullet hole through its forehead. Same clean shot, same recent blood. Both kills were precise. Single rounds, placed exactly where they needed to be. No wasted ammunition, no spray of misses on the road around them. These were disciplined shooters. Atticus stood and moved behind the sandbag wall. Shell casings littered the ground, brass glinting in the light. He counted 8 of them, all the same caliber. Rifle rounds, military grade. He picked one up and rolled it between his fingers. It was clean and bright, no tarnish, no weathering. Fresh. Beyond the sandbags, tire tracks scored the soft shoulder of the road. Heavy treads, deep impressions, the kind made by military vehicles with real weight to them. Trucks or armored transports, not civilian cars. He followed the tracks with his eyes. Multiple vehicles had come down this road, stopped at the checkpoint, and then continued east. The tracks overlapped in places, suggesting they'd come through at different times, or the same vehicles had made multiple trips. He walked further down the road, past the checkpoint, studying the ground. More tire tracks. A patch of oil on the pavement where a vehicle had sat, idling long enough to leave a stain. A couple of boot prints pressed into a muddy spot near the ditch, the tread pattern uniform and consistent. Military boots, standard issue. At least 2 different sizes, which meant at least 2 different people on foot. Off to the side of the road, near where the ditch met the fence line of the adjacent field, he found something else. A pile of empty water bottles, tossed in a heap. 4 of them, the heavy-duty reusable kind that military personnel carried. They'd been drained and discarded, not crushed or stuffed in a bag, just dropped. Next to them, a crumpled food wrapper, field rations. The soldiers had eaten here, hydrated, and moved on without cleaning up after themselves, sloppy or comfortable. Either way, it told Atticus they weren't worried about being found. He crouched by the boot prints and thought it through. The checkpoint was temporary, set up, used, and then abandoned. The sawhorses and sandbags were still here, which meant whoever built it didn't bother to tear it down. Either they were coming back, or they didn't care about leaving evidence of their presence. The tire tracks heading east told him the vehicles had moved on, probably toward one of the towns deeper into Bennett's territory. The dead ghouls and fresh shell casings told him the soldiers had encountered creatures while they were here and dealt with them efficiently. But what were they doing this far south, this close to the Wichita spillover zone? Atticus straightened up and looked south, toward the haze on the horizon that marked where the sky met the sprawl of the dead city. He thought back to his previous trip through Kansas, the intelligence he'd gathered, the patterns he'd observed. Bennett's soldiers had been scouting Wichita even then, not clearing it, not trying to reclaim it, just assessing, counting the zombie population, studying the fortifications the military had built around the city's perimeter before everything fell apart, taking notes on entry and exit points, road conditions, structural integrity of the barriers. Bennett was treating Wichita's zombie population like inventory, something to be cataloged and eventually used. And now his people were out here, running checkpoints on the roads leading toward the city, doing groundwork that suggested the planning had moved past the assessment phase and into something more active. That thought sat heavy in his gut. He walked back to the SUV, where Gideon was standing watch near the front bumper, his katana held low at his side. A creature had wandered within about 100 yards of them from the east field, but it was moving at an angle that would carry it past without incident. "What did you find?" Gideon asked. Atticus leaned against the hood. "Bennett's men were here, recently, and they might still be in the area." Gideon let that sit for a second. "How recently?" "A day, 2 at the outside. They set up a checkpoint, ran multiple vehicles through it, and headed east. This wasn't a patrol that wandered through. It was coordinated." "What for?" "Scouting, most likely. Last time I was in Kansas, Bennett's soldiers were running reconnaissance on Wichita, studying the fortifications, assessing the creatures inside the city. This checkpoint is on a road that runs parallel to the city's northern outskirts, perfect position to stage from if you're sending teams in to take a closer look." "So they're probing the perimeter," Gideon said. "That's what it looks like. And it's not casual. You don't set up a sandbag position and run multiple vehicles through a checkpoint unless you're coordinating something. This was planned, resourced, and executed. Somebody up the chain signed off on it." Meat had gotten out of the SUV and was standing nearby, listening. "You think they're getting ready to do something with Wichita?" "I think they've been getting ready for a while," Atticus said. "And whatever it is, the pace is picking up." "What would Bennett want with a city full of zombies?" Meat asked. "It's not like he can clear it, not with the numbers he's got." "He doesn't want to clear it," Atticus said. "That's the part that worries me. A man with an army doesn't spend this kind of effort studying something he plans to destroy. He studies it because he plans to use it." The three of them were quiet for a moment, the weight of it settling in. A zombie in the field to the east had adjusted its path and was now shuffling toward them, drawn by the sound of voices. Still a good distance off, but closing. "This changes things," Gideon said. "It does. If Bennett's soldiers are operating this close to Garden Plain, Madison might have more to worry about than just the creatures. She picked that town because the zombies would keep the soldiers away. But if they're already running missions in the spillover zone, her cover isn't as solid as she thinks." "So we move faster," Meat said. Atticus nodded. "We move faster." He pushed off the hood and scanned the area one more time. The ghoul in the field was still coming, and a second one had appeared further back, following the same general path. From the west, 3 more were visible on the highway they had left behind, standing at the intersection where the side road branched off, their heads turned toward the SUV. "Time to go," Atticus said. They loaded back into the vehicle. Atticus started the engine, turned the SUV around, and headed back to the highway. He paused at the intersection, checking both directions. The density hadn't improved. If anything, the ghouls on the road had shifted south while they had been stopped, filling in the stretch ahead of them with more bodies than before. He turned south and pressed the accelerator. The checkpoint stayed behind them, the sawhorses and sandbags shrinking in the mirror until the road curved and they disappeared. But what Atticus had found there didn't shrink with distance. It sat in his mind, growing heavier the more he turned it over. Bennett's people were out here, active, recent, running operations in territory that was supposed to be too dangerous for anyone to bother with. And somewhere ahead, in a small town drowning in creatures, Madison was surviving on the assumption that the ghouls around her were enough to keep the soldiers away. She needed to know that assumption might be wrong. Gideon seemed to read the shift in Atticus's mood. He didn't say anything, but his posture changed, straightening in the passenger seat, his eyes moving with more purpose across the landscape. Meat was the same in the back, leaning forward slightly, scanning the fields and ditches on either side of the highway, like he expected to see a convoy of military trucks come rolling out of the tree line. They pushed south, weaving through the thickening crowds of creatures on the highway, the moaning growing louder with every mile. Atticus drove with a new edge to his focus, his eyes scanning not just for ghouls on the road, but for tire tracks, boot prints, shell casings, any sign that the soldiers had been on this road too. Because if Bennett's reach extended this far into the spillover zone, then nowhere in Kansas was as safe as they thought. Chapter 5. The road ahead was no longer a road. It was a crowd. Ghouls filled both lanes for as far as Atticus could see, dozens of them shuffling south in a loose mass that stretched from shoulder to shoulder. More were visible in the fields on either side, drifting toward the highway in a slow convergence that had no end in sight. The moaning was constant now, a droning wall of sound that pressed in from every direction and vibrated through the frame of the SUV. Atticus brought the vehicle to a stop, not because anything was blocking him specifically, but because the math had finally caught up. Every yard forward pulled more creatures toward the engine noise. The trailing mass behind them had grown into something he couldn't ignore anymore, a spreading wake of dead bodies following the sound, dozens deep and getting wider. If he pushed through the crowd ahead, he'd add them to the trail, and if he had to stop for any reason, if the road got blocked or the SUV took damage, that trail would close around them like a fist. "This is it," he said. Gideon looked through the windshield at the packed highway. "Agreed." Meat leaned forward between the seats. "So where do we put the SUV?" Atticus scanned the landscape on both sides of the road. Flat fields, fence lines, a few scattered trees. Nothing useful. He needed something enclosed, something with walls and a door that would keep the creatures from tearing the vehicle apart while they were gone. A garage, a shed, a barn, anything with a roof and four sides. He spotted it about a quarter-mile to the west. A farmstead sitting back from the highway, partially hidden by a row of trees that ran along the property line. The house was a two-story with a wraparound porch, and behind it, set about 50 yards back, was a barn. Not a small one either. It was a full-size structure with a peaked roof and wide double doors on the near side, big enough to park a vehicle inside with room to spare. "There," Atticus said, pointing. "I see it," Gideon said. Getting to it was the problem. Between the highway and the farmstead was an open field with no fence, which was good, but there were zombies scattered across it, a handful visible from where they sat, with more likely on the other side of the tree line where they couldn't see. The SUV could handle the open ground, but the engine noise would draw everything in the area straight to them. "We go fast," Atticus said. "Straight across the field, into the barn, and kill the engine. The creatures will follow the noise, but if we're fast enough, we'll be inside before they close in." "And if the barn doors are locked," Meat asked, "then we break them open." "Fair enough." Atticus turned the wheel and left the highway, the SUV bumping down the shallow ditch and onto the open field. The grass was knee-high and dry, the ground firm enough to hold the tires. He pressed the accelerator, and the SUV surged forward, bouncing over the uneven terrain as they crossed the distance to the farmstead. A ghoul standing in the field turned toward them as they passed, reaching out with one hand like it was trying to hail a cab. Another one, further back, started shuffling in their direction. A third emerged from behind the tree line, stumbling into the open with its head cocked toward the sound. The barn grew larger in the windshield as they closed the distance. The double doors were shut, but didn't appear to be padlocked. Atticus aimed the SUV at the gap between the house and the barn, swinging around the backside of the property and pulling up in front of the doors. "Meat, doors!" he said. Meat was already moving. He threw open the back door and crossed the distance to the barn in 3 big strides. He grabbed the handle on the left door and pulled. It resisted for a second, the wood swollen and stuck in its track, and then it broke free and swung wide with a groan of rusty hinges. He grabbed the right door and hauled it open the same way. The interior of the barn was dim and dusty. Hay bales were stacked along one wall, old equipment sat in the corners, and the floor was hard-packed dirt. And standing in the middle of it, swaying in the sudden light, were 3 creatures. 2 of them were close together near the hay bales, their clothes torn and filthy, their skin the gray-white of something that had been dead for a long time. The third was further back, near a stall door that hung open on one hinge. All 3 turned toward the light and the noise, mouths opening, that low moan starting in their throats. Gideon was out of the SUV before Atticus had it in park. He moved past Meat and into the barn without breaking stride, his blade already drawn. The first ghoul went down before it could take a step, the blade splitting its skull in a clean diagonal cut. Gideon pivoted on his back foot, reversed the blade, and drove it through the temple of the second one. It dropped next to the first, both of them crumpling to the dirt in a heap. The third creature had started toward him, arms reaching, but Gideon closed the distance before it could get within grabbing range. A short, sharp thrust through the forehead, and it was done. 3 zombies, maybe 5 seconds. He flicked the blade clean and stepped back. "Clear," he said. Atticus pulled the SUV into the barn, the tires crunching on the packed earth. The interior was tight but workable, with enough room to park the vehicle and still move around it. Meat swung the doors shut behind them and dropped a heavy wooden beam across the brackets to bar them from inside. The engine noise cut off and the barn went quiet. Dust motes drifted in the thin shafts of light that came through gaps in the siding. Outside, the moaning continued, muffled now by the walls, but still present. Still close. "That'll hold," Meat said, testing the beam with a push. The doors didn't budge. Anything that wants in is going to have to work for it. Atticus killed the headlights and sat in the dark for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the barn floor. "All right," he said. "This is where we switch over. Everything from here is on foot, and everything is quiet. No gunshots unless we're about to die. Blades, hands, whatever you've got that doesn't make noise." He moved to the back of the SUV and opened the hatch. Their gear was packed in tight duffel bags and supply containers, filling the cargo space. He started pulling what they'd need. Water, 2 bottles each. Food, enough for a day and a half. A small first aid kit. His knife was already on his belt. He checked it, then checked his backup handgun in the holster at his back. Last resort only. He also grabbed a pair of binoculars from one of the duffel bags and hung them around his neck. They'd need eyes on the town before they walked into it. Gideon had his sword and the collection of ninja stars he kept in a pouch on his belt. He also had a folding knife that he tucked into his boot. He moved through his prep with the calm focus of a man who had done this kind of thing before, even if the context had been movie sets rather than actual combat until recently. He rolled his shoulders, loosening up, and did a few slow stretches that looked more like a warm-up routine than nervous energy. "You always stretch before walking into zombie territory?" Meat asked. "I always stretch before anything," Gideon said. "When you get to be my age, you run the risk of pulling a hamstring getting out of bed in the morning, let alone fighting." Meat looked down at his pipe wrench, then back at Atticus. "I know," Atticus said. "It's loud. It's reliable," Meat countered. "It's loud and it's reliable. But out there, loud gets us killed. You've got your knife?" Meat pulled a heavy fixed blade from a sheath on his belt. It looked almost normal-sized in his hand, which meant it was probably a 10-inch blade on anyone else. "I've got it," he said. "But if things get close and ugly, the wrench is coming out. If things get close and ugly, I won't stop you." Meat nodded and strapped the wrench across his back, handle up over his shoulder where he could reach it fast, a compromise they could both live with. Atticus pulled out the road atlas and spread it on the hood of the SUV. The light in the barn was dim, but enough to read by. He traced their position with his finger. "We're here. Garden Plain is roughly 5 miles southwest." He tapped the small dot on the map. "We go cross-country, staying off the roads. Those things are going to be everywhere, but the rougher the terrain, the fewer we're going to encounter." At least that's my hope, Atticus said. 5 miles through that, Meat said, looking toward the barn wall as if he could see through it to the fields beyond. Any idea where in Garden Plain she'd be? Atticus shook his head. Come on, Meat. You don't want this to be too easy, do you? Besides, Garden Plain doesn't sound like it's too big, so it shouldn't be too hard to track her down. So we're walking 5 miles through the worst territory we've seen so far to search a town we've never been to for a woman who could be anywhere in it, Meat said. That's about the size of it. Just wanted to make sure I had the full picture. Gideon slid his sword into the scabbard on his back and adjusted the strap across his chest. She's trained. She'll have a position set up that's defensible and concealed. When we get to the town, we look for signs of her. Cleared zombies, covered windows, barricaded doors, anything that looks like a person has been there recently. That's the play, Atticus said. We get in, we search smart, and we stay quiet. If she's there, she'll have left signs. We just have to read them. He folded the atlas and tucked it into his pack. The three of them stood in the dim barn for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do sitting between them. 5 miles on foot through dead country, with nothing but blades and silence between them and a town full of ghouls. Meat shouldered his pack and adjusted the wrench across his back. Let's get moving. Atticus led them to a side door on the east wall of the barn. He eased it open and checked the area. A few zombies were visible near the front of the property, drawn by the engine noise from their arrival, but the backside was clear for the moment. Open fields stretched south and west, the grass waving in the breeze, with scattered ghouls visible at distance, but none close enough to be a concern. He stepped out into the open air. Gideon followed, then Meat, ducking through the doorframe that wasn't built for a man his size. Atticus pulled the door shut behind them, leaving the SUV hidden in the dark of the barn. The wind hit them first. It was warm and steady, carrying the smell of dry grass and something else underneath it, the faint, sour tang of decay that hung over everything this close to the city. The moaning was still there, distant but unbroken, a sound that had become so constant it almost blended into the background. Almost. Atticus took one last look back at the barn, marking its position in his mind. They'd need to find their way back to it, possibly in a hurry, possibly in the dark. The tree line, the 2-story house, the peaked roof of the barn. He committed the landmarks and turned south. They left the barn, left the SUV, left the highway behind them, and walked into the fields. Chapter 6. The first mile was the hardest to get used to. On the highway, in the SUV, the zombies had been something you drove around. Obstacles on the road, shapes in the fields, things that reached for the vehicle as it passed and then fell behind. There was glass between you and them, speed, an engine that could push through anything that got in the way. On foot, all of that was gone. The creatures were everywhere, not packed together, not in hordes, but scattered across the landscape in a way that made it impossible to look in any direction without seeing at least a few. They wandered through the fields, shuffled along dirt roads, stood motionless in the grass like scarecrows that had climbed down from their posts. Some moved with purpose, heading in one direction or another for reasons only the dead understood. Others just swayed in place, mouths hanging open, eyes fixed on nothing. The trio stuck to the tree lines and fence rows, using whatever cover the flat landscape offered. They moved in short bursts, 50 yards at a time, pausing behind a cluster of trees or a stretch of brush to scan ahead before pushing on. The pace was slow, painfully slow. Every step had to be measured, every direction checked, every sound weighed against the risk of drawing attention. Atticus led, picking the route through the terrain by reading the ground ahead like a trail. He looked for low spots, depressions in the fields where they could move without being silhouetted against the sky. He watched for ghouls that were facing their direction and timed their movements to pass behind them. He listened for the moaning, using it to gauge distance and density, figuring out where the concentrations were thickest and steering around them. Gideon moved second, his katana drawn and held low against his leg. He covered the left side, his eyes sweeping in steady arcs, picking up movement that Atticus might miss while focused on the route ahead. He moved quietly, his footfalls light despite his size, each step placed with a precision that came from decades of martial arts training. Meat brought up the rear. He was the loudest of the three by nature, his sheer mass making it harder to move silently through the grass. But he compensated by being careful. He watched behind them, making sure nothing was following, and kept enough distance from Gideon that they wouldn't bunch up if something came at them from the side. The first zombie that got too close came out of a drainage ditch they hadn't seen. It rose up out of the tall weeds like something surfacing from underwater, its head appearing first, then its shoulders, then its reaching hands. It was less than 10 feet from Atticus when he spotted it. He didn't hesitate. He sidestepped, caught the ghoul by the back of its shirt, and drove his knife into the base of its skull. The blade went in clean, and the creature went limp, sagging against him like a puppet with cut strings. He lowered it to the ground without a sound and pulled the knife free. Gideon watched from a few yards back, his katana ready, but he hadn't needed to move. Atticus wiped the blade on the grass and kept going. The second kill came 10 minutes later. A zombie wandering along a fence line spotted them and turned, its moan rising in pitch as it locked on. Gideon was on it before the sound could carry. 2 quick strides and a horizontal cut that took the top of its head off just above the ears. The body dropped and the moan cut off like someone had flipped a switch. They kept moving. A rhythm developed. Move, watch, kill, move. It wasn't something they discussed or planned. It just happened the way it does when people who are good at what they do start working together in dangerous situations. Atticus read the terrain and set the pace. Gideon handled anything that got within blade range. Meat watched their backs and stayed ready to step in if the other two got overwhelmed. By the second mile, the rhythm was smooth. By the third, it was second nature. They paused behind a row of hedges that ran along an old property line. The brush was thick enough to hide them from view, and the ground on the far side dropped into a shallow depression that gave them a moment of concealment. Atticus took a knee and scanned ahead with the binoculars. More fields, more scattered creatures, more of the same flat nothing that Kansas had been serving up since they'd left Grand Bend. Meat settled onto the ground with his back against a fence post, breathing steady but heavy. The walk was taking more out of him than the other two, not because he was out of shape, but because moving a man his size quietly through open terrain was work. Every step required effort that a smaller person wouldn't have to think about. "You holding up?" Atticus asked, keeping his voice low. "I'm fine, just not built for sneaking." "Could have fooled me," Gideon said. "You've been quieter than I expected." "Don't sound so surprised," Meat said. "I can be delicate when I want to be." Gideon smiled at that. The three of them sat in the shade of the hedgerow, catching their breath and drinking water. The moaning drifted across the fields around them, that constant backdrop that never fully went away. A group of 5 ghouls was visible about 200 yards to the south, moving slowly across an open field in a loose cluster. None of them had noticed the trio. Meat capped his water bottle and looked out at the landscape. "Before all this, I ran a custom bike shop in Portland, had 6 guys working for me, a waiting list that went out 9 months, built choppers, baggers, cafe racers, you name it. If it had 2 wheels and an engine, I could build it or fix it." Atticus glanced at him. He hadn't asked, but he didn't mind the offering. Out here, with nothing but danger and flat ground in every direction, people talked when they needed to. It was how you stayed human. "Good business?" Atticus asked. "Best years of my life. Woke up every day and went to work on something I loved. Had a little house in northeast Portland, a garage full of parts, and half a dozen guys who worked with me." He paused. "I still have no idea what happened to them. I was up in Seattle on a delivery when all this started. I was just lucky Buck and the others were up here." Nobody said anything for a moment. There wasn't much to say. Everyone who'd survived this long had a story like that, a life that existed before and didn't anymore, with a gap in the middle that was too ugly to look at directly. "I sat in a chair for 3 days, Gideon said. Meat looked at him. "What?" "When it started. I was in my condo in Santa Barbara, 3rd floor, overlooking the courtyard. The zombies showed up in the courtyard on the first day. Fast ones, fresh ones. I watched them from my window, just sat in my recliner and watched." He said it matter-of-factly, no shame in it, just honesty. "I watched people try to run, watch them get caught, watch them come back as one of those things. 3 days of that, sitting in a leather chair, eating the last of whatever was in my kitchen." "What got you out of the chair?" Atticus asked. "Ran out of food," Gideon said with a slight grin. That and I realized that sitting there watching people die while I had a closet full of weapons and 30 years of training was about the most useless thing a man could do with his last days on Earth. "So you picked up the sword," Meat said. "I picked up the sword, cut my way out of the building, found some people who needed help, and kept going until the Navy picked us up off the coast." He looked down at the weapon resting across his knees. "Spent my whole career pretending to be a hero on screen. Turns out the real thing is a lot less glamorous and a lot more terrifying." "But you're still here," Atticus said. "I'm still here," Gideon agreed. Atticus listened to both of them and appreciated the honesty. He didn't offer his own story, not because he didn't trust them, but because his story was still happening. Susie was back in Seattle. Evelyn was taking care of her. The people he'd left behind in Kansas were depending on him to come back. His story didn't have a clean break between before and after. It was all still connected, still in motion, and talking about it out loud felt like tempting something he didn't want to tempt. Gideon and Meat seemed to understand. Neither of them pushed. They finished their water, checked their gear, and got back on their feet. The 4th mile brought them through a stretch of farmland where the ghoul density picked up. The creatures were thicker here, clusters of 10 or more visible in the fields, with individuals filling in the gaps between them. The moaning grew louder, overlapping from multiple directions, until it became a single unbroken sound. They moved slower, more carefully, the gaps between cover getting shorter as the number of ghouls increased. Atticus put down 3 more in quick succession, each one a quiet kill from behind, the knife doing its work without fanfare. Gideon handled 2 that wandered into their path from a cornfield, the katana, whisper quiet in the still air. At one point, a creature stumbled out of a collapsed shed not 5 feet from Meat. He caught it by the throat with one hand before it could moan, held it at arm's length while it clawed at his forearm, and drove his knife up through its jaw into its brain. He set the body down without a word and kept walking. Atticus and Gideon exchanged a look, but said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. They crested a low rise at the edge of a harvested field, and Atticus held up a fist. The other 2 stopped. He raised the binoculars and looked south. Garden Plain sat in the distance, maybe a mile and a half out. A small cluster of buildings, rooftops, and a grain elevator and the steeple of a church, all of it sitting in the flat open landscape like an island in a dead sea. The town was tiny, a few blocks at most. The kind of place you drive through in 30 seconds and never think about again. Behind it, further south and east, the skyline of Wichita rose against the horizon. It was hazy and indistinct, the buildings shimmering in the distance like a mirage. But it was unmistakable. A city. A dead city, filled with hundreds of thousands of creatures that had once been its population. And between them and Garden Plain, the fields were crawling with zombies. More than they'd seen on the entire walk. The density was staggering, ghouls visible in every direction, moving through the grass and along the dirt roads in numbers that made counting pointless. Atticus lowered the binoculars and handed them to Gideon, who took a long look before passing them to Meat. Meat stared through the lenses for a while, then lowered them and handed the binoculars back to Atticus. "Well," he said quietly, "there it is." Garden Plain looked like a place that had been forgotten long before the dead started walking. Small, flat, unremarkable, the kind of town that existed because someone had built a grain elevator there 100 years ago, and a few families had stuck around out of habit. Now it was drowning in creatures, and somewhere inside it was the one person who could tell them what was really happening in Kansas. The 3 of them stood on the rise, looking south at the small town, sitting in the shadow of the dead city, and the ocean of walking dead that stood between them and whoever was waiting inside. Chapter 7. The irrigation ditch was a lifesaver. They found it at the bottom of the rise, a concrete-lined channel about 4 feet deep and twice as wide, running south through the fields toward the outskirts of town. It was dry, the water long since stopped flowing, and the concrete was cracked and weathered. But it was below ground level, which meant they could move through it without being seen by anything standing in the fields above. Atticus dropped into the ditch first, his boots hitting the dry concrete with a soft scrape. Gideon followed, landing quietly beside him. Meat lowered himself in with more effort, his broad shoulders nearly brushing both walls. It was tight for him, But it was cover, and cover was worth the discomfort. They moved south through the channel in single file, heads below the lip of the ditch, the sky a narrow strip above them. The moaning was louder down here, the concrete walls channeling the sound from every direction into a steady, echoing drone. Zombies were visible on both sides when Atticus risked a glance over the edge. Dozens of them, wandering through the fields in loose groups, their shapes dark against the dry grass. None of them looked down into the ditch. Their eyes were fixed ahead, or on nothing at all, the way they always were, staring at a world they no longer understood. At one point, a ghoul stumbled to the very edge of the channel, its feet sending a shower of loose dirt down onto the concrete floor. It stood there, swaying less than 2 feet above Meat's head. All three of them froze, pressed against the walls, not breathing. The creature lingered for what felt like a full minute, its low moan echoing down into the channel before it shuffled sideways and drifted back into the field. Meat let out a slow breath, and they kept moving. The ditch carried them nearly half a mile before it curved east and began to shallow out. Atticus held up a fist, and the other two stopped. He eased up to the lip and raised the binoculars. Garden plains spread out ahead of them, close enough now to pick out individual buildings. It was small, smaller than he'd expected, even knowing the population had been a few hundred at best. A handful of residential blocks, the houses set back from the streets on modest lots with fenced yards and detached garages. A church with a white steeple sat on the east side, its parking lot empty. A grain elevator rose up on the north end, the tallest structure in town, its metal siding dull and streaked with rust. Along what passed for a main road, a short row of commercial buildings lined up shoulder to shoulder. A hardware store, what looked like a diner, a small municipal building with a flagpole out front. The flag was gone, and filling every inch of it, the dead. Ghouls packed the streets and yards in numbers that made the fields they'd walked through look empty by comparison. They shuffled between the houses and along the sidewalks in a slow, aimless current, dozens visible on every block, with more emerging from alleys and open doorways in a steady trickle. The main road was thick with them, a river of shambling bodies flowing in no particular direction. Yards that should have been quiet were crowded with creatures standing in the grass, swaying, bumping into fences and each other, and not caring about either. The noise was something else entirely. Out in the fields, the moaning had been a background hum, always present but spread thin across the open landscape. Here, it was concentrated. Every creature in town was adding its voice to the chorus, and the buildings and streets focused the sound into a wall that hit Atticus in the chest even from this distance. A low, constant droning moan that didn't rise or fall, just pressed in from every direction like a weight. He could smell the town, too. The wind carried it north across the fields, a thick, sour stench of decay and rot that clung to the back of his throat. Thousands of dead bodies, standing upright and walking around in the sun, day after day. The smell was something you could almost taste. "That's a lot of company," Gideon said from below, reading Atticus's expression. "More than a lot." Atticus kept the binoculars up, scanning the town block by block. He was looking for something specific, not the dead. He already knew the dead were there. He was looking for signs of the living, boarded windows, cleared paths, barricaded doors, anything that said a human being had been here recently and done something deliberate. The zombies didn't board windows. They didn't clear paths. They didn't make choices. Any sign of choice in this town was a sign of Madison. He started on the north end and worked south, scanning each house methodically. Most of them were the same, windows dark or broken, doors closed or standing open, yards full of wandering zombies. A few houses had damage that suggested the creatures had tried to get in at some point, smashed porch railings and dented door frames, but nothing that looked recent. The town had been overrun a long time ago, and whatever resistance its residents had put up was long since finished. One house on the north side had its front door torn completely off the hinges, and through the empty doorway he could see movement inside. Zombies shuffling through someone's living room, bumping into furniture. Another house had a second-floor balcony where a ghoul stood motionless, gripping the railing, staring out at nothing. It had probably been up there for weeks. He moved the binoculars south, past the commercial strip, into the residential blocks on the far side of town. More of the same. House after house, block after block, all of it dead and decaying under the Kansas sun. Then he saw it. A house on the south side of town, 2-story, set back from the street with a covered porch and a detached garage. The ground floor windows were dark, same as every other house. But the upstairs windows were different. They were intact, no cracks, no breaks, and they were covered from the inside, not with plywood or boards which would have been visible and noticeable from the outside, with dark fabric, curtains or blankets, something that blocked the light and the view without advertising that someone had done it. It was subtle. From street level, walking past, you might not notice the difference between those windows and any other dark window in town. But from up here, with binoculars and distance and the right angle, the distinction was clear. Every other covered window in Garden Plain was covered by damage, broken glass, hanging shutters, debris. This house was covered by intent. "I've got something," Atticus said. "South side, 2-story with a covered porch. Upstairs windows are blacked out from the inside. Fabric, not boards." He handed the binoculars down to Gideon, who climbed up next to him and found the house. He studied it for a long moment. "Someone hanging sheets on the windows," Gideon said. "That just might be our girl." "That's what I'm thinking." Gideon kept scanning while he was up there, sweeping the binoculars slowly across the town. He paused on the east side, adjusted the focus, and stayed there. "Atticus, east side, along the fence line that runs behind the church." Atticus took the binoculars back and found the spot. A wooden fence ran along the back edge of a property on the east side of town, separating a backyard from the open field beyond. And lying along the base of that fence in a neat row were bodies. Zombies, 6 of them, laid out one after another like cordwood. Even from this distance he could see the wounds. Each one had been taken down with a single strike to the skull, the kind of clean, efficient kill that spoke of someone who had done it many times and knew exactly where to place the blade. The bodies were recent, a day or two at most, judging by the condition, and they'd been moved. Someone had killed these creatures and then dragged them to the fence line, clearing them from a path that ran from the east side of town toward the south, toward the house with the covered windows. "She's clearing a route," Atticus said, culling the ones closest to her position and moving the bodies so they don't attract attention. "Disciplined," Gideon said. "That's Madison." Meat had been listening from below, his head tilted up, following the conversation. "So she's in there." Atticus lowered the binoculars and looked at the town spread out below them. The ghouls filling the streets, the constant moaning, the sheer density of dead bodies standing between them and that house on the south side. It was maybe 8 blocks from where they were to where Madison was holed up. 8 blocks through the most heavily infested stretch of ground they'd seen since leaving Seattle. "She's in there," Atticus said. "Now we just have to get to her." He slid back down into the ditch, and the 3 of them crouched in the concrete channel, the walls of the irrigation ditch blocking the view of the town, but doing nothing to block the sound. The moaning rolled over them, constant and close. "We're not going in right now," Atticus said. "Not in the open like this. We need to study the layout, figure out which streets have the lightest concentration, and pick a route that gives us the best chance of getting through without drawing the whole town down on us." "How long?" Gideon asked. "However long it takes to do it right. We didn't walk 5 miles to get ourselves killed in the last 8 blocks. Gideon nodded. He drew his blade and laid it across his knees, settling in with the patience of a man who understood that waiting was part of the job. "I'll take a turn watching when you need a break," he said. Meat adjusted the wrench across his back and found a position against the ditch wall that didn't look entirely uncomfortable, which for a man his size in a 4-foot channel was an achievement. "So we wait and we watch." Atticus moved back to the lip of the ditch, resting the binoculars on the concrete edge, and began the slow work of studying Garden Plain block by block. He watched the flow of the ghouls through the streets, looking for patterns, where they clustered, where they thinned out, whether they moved in consistent directions or drifted at random. He watched the alleys between buildings, the yards, the gaps between houses. He traced the route from the north end of town to the south side, looking for the path with the fewest dead between here and the house with the covered windows. The 3 of them settled into the ditch, backs against the concrete, weapons close. Above them, the moaning continued, hundreds of voices blending into one unbroken sound that hung over Garden Plain like a fog. Somewhere inside that sound, behind the covered windows of a house on the south side of town, Madison was alive. Atticus could feel it the way a tracker feels the trail getting warm. She was in there, doing what she'd been trained to do, surviving on skill and discipline, and whatever stubborn refusal to quit had kept her going this long. They just had to reach her. Chapter 8. They went in at the northwest corner of town, where the residential blocks met the open fields. Atticus had spent the better part of an hour studying the layout from the ditch, watching the movement of the ghouls through the streets and looking for gaps in the density. There weren't many, but the northwest corner had a stretch where the houses were spaced further apart, with bigger yards and more fencing between properties. The creatures there moved in thinner numbers than the main road or the south side of town. It wasn't safe. Nothing about this was safe, but it was the least dangerous way in. They climbed out of the irrigation ditch and crossed the last 100 yards of open field in a low crouch, moving fast and quiet. A pair of zombies stood in the field about 50 yards to the east, their backs turned, swaying in place. Neither one reacted. The trio reached the first fence line at the edge of town and slipped over it into a backyard choked with dead grass and an overturned patio set. The smell hit them first. Out in the fields, it had been a faint sourness on the wind. Inside the town, surrounded by buildings that trapped the air and blocked the breeze, it was thick enough to taste. Rot, decay, and something chemical underneath it that burned the sinuses. The smell of hundreds of dead bodies packed into a few square blocks and left to bake in the Kansas heat. Meat covered his nose with the back of his hand, but didn't say anything. Gideon's jaw tightened, but he kept moving. Atticus breathed through his mouth and pushed it aside. They had bigger problems than the smell. The yard they had landed in was clear. The house beside it had its back door standing open, and from inside came the sound of something shuffling. Slow, heavy footsteps on hardwood floors. Something was in there, moving around in the dark, but it hadn't noticed them. Atticus pointed away from the open door and led them along the fence line to the adjacent property. They moved from yard to yard, staying behind fences and hedges, using the houses as cover. The streets were out of the question. Even from the backyards, Atticus could see the ghouls filling the roads, shuffling past in a steady current that never stopped. Dozens of them on every block, their moaning blending together into that constant low drone that seemed to come from the ground itself. The first block went slowly. Every 10 feet brought a new decision. Go left around the garage or right through the gap in the fence. Wait for the creature in the side yard to drift past, or take it down and risk the noise of the body hitting the ground. Cross the open stretch between houses in one quick burst, or find another way around. Gideon handled the first kill inside the town, a zombie standing in a narrow passage between two houses, facing the street, blocking their path. Gideon came up behind it with the katana low and drove the blade through the back of its skull in a single upward thrust. The creature dropped straight down, folding at the knees and settling to the ground like a puppet. No stumble, no flailing, no noise beyond the soft thud of dead weight on grass. Clean. They stepped over the body and kept going. The second block was worse. The yards were smaller here, the houses closer together, and the creatures were thicker. A group of 4 zombies stood in a cluster between a shed and a chain-link fence, close enough to each other that their shoulders nearly touched. Atticus studied them for a moment, then led the trio around the long way, adding 50 yards to their route to avoid the cluster entirely. Better to lose time than make noise. They crossed a dirt alley that ran behind a row of houses, and Atticus held up a fist. Ahead, a ghoul was shuffling down the alley toward them, its head hanging low, its feet dragging through the dirt. It hadn't seen them yet, but it was heading straight for their position. Gideon moved forward without being asked. He timed the creature's pace, waited until it was within arm's reach, and brought the katana across in a short horizontal arc that caught the ghoul at the temple. The blade bit deep, and the creature's legs gave out. Gideon caught the body with his free hand and lowered it to the ground without a sound. He pulled the blade free, wiped it on the dead thing's shirt, and stepped back into line. 3 blocks in, 5 to go. The moaning pressed in from every direction now, close enough that individual voices were distinguishable within the wall of sound. A deeper groan from the left, a higher, rattling wheeze from somewhere ahead, the scrape of feet on pavement, constant and rhythmic, like rain on a tin roof. The town was alive with the dead, every street and yard and doorway filled with movement that never stopped and never changed. Atticus navigated by memory, working from the mental map he'd built during his observation from the ditch. He knew where the main road was and stayed well clear of it. He knew the density was lightest on the western edge of town and kept them there as long as he could, before they'd have to cut east toward the south side. He tracked the position of the house with the covered windows in his head, adjusting their route block by block as the terrain and the density dictated. They rounded the corner of a detached garage, and Atticus stopped short. A zombie was standing less than 6 feet away, facing them, its dead eyes looking straight at him. It had been standing in the shadow of the garage, motionless, invisible until they were right on top of it. Its mouth opened. The beginning of a moan started in its throat. Atticus lunged. He closed the distance in one step, grabbed the creature by the jaw with his left hand, and drove his knife up through the soft tissue under its chin. The blade punched through the roof of its mouth and into the brain. The moan died before it became anything more than a gurgle. The zombie went rigid, then slack, and Atticus lowered it to the ground with both hands, easing it down as carefully as if he were laying a sleeping child in a crib. He stayed crouched over the body for a moment, listening. The moaning around them continued unchanged. No shift in pitch, no surge of movement, no sign that anything had heard. He pulled the knife free, wiped it on his jeans, and kept moving. 4 blocks in, 4 to go. They cut east between 2 houses and crossed into the next row of properties. The density jumped. Ghouls were everywhere now, filling the yards and alleys in numbers that made picking a path feel like threading a needle. Atticus slowed the pace to a crawl, every step deliberate, every movement timed to the gaps between the wandering dead. Then he found the first sign of Madison. A creature lay face down in the grass beside a garden shed, its body half hidden by overgrown weeds. Atticus almost stepped over it before the wound caught his eye. A single puncture in the back of the skull, narrow and precise, the kind of mark left by a heavy-bladed knife driven in with force and accuracy. No slashing, no hacking, no wasted effort. One strike, placed exactly where it needed to be to kill instantly. He knelt beside the body and examined the wound. The entry point was clean, the angle suggesting the attacker had come from behind and slightly above. Someone had walked up to this zombie, put a blade through its brain from the rear, and moved on. No struggle, no noise. A kill made by someone who had done it many times. He caught Gideon's eye and pointed at the wound. Gideon looked, understood, and nodded. They pushed on. A block further south, they found another one. This zombie was slumped against a fence post, its head tilted back, the same narrow puncture wound in the base of its skull. Same precision, same angle, same quiet efficiency. And like the first, the body had been left where it fell, not moved or hidden, but placed along what amounted to a path between the north side of town and the south. Madison had been clearing a route, not dragging the bodies to the fence line like the ones they'd seen from the ditch, but culling the zombies along a specific path through the town's interior, thinning the density between her position and whatever route she used to move in and out. "She's good," Gideon said, barely above a whisper. Atticus nodded. He was starting to see the pattern now. The kills weren't random. They formed a loose channel through the densest part of town, a thread of cleared ground that wound between houses and along fence lines, avoiding the main road and the worst of the concentrations. Madison had been navigating this town on foot, alone, killing the ghouls that blocked her path and leaving the rest alone, surgical, disciplined, exactly what you'd expect from someone trained to operate behind enemy lines. They followed the trail, another body in a side yard, same wound pattern, another one near a back porch, crumpled at the bottom of the steps. Each kill was a breadcrumb, leading them deeper into the town and closer to the south side. 5 blocks in, 3 to go. The going got harder. The zombies were packed tighter here, the gap between Madison's cleared path and the surrounding density narrowing with every block. Ghouls wandered within arm's reach of the trail, some of them brushing against the fences and hedges that defined the route. One wrong step, one bump, one sound too loud, and the whole thing would collapse. Meat was having the hardest time. His size, which was an asset in a fight, was a liability in tight spaces filled with things that hunted by sound. He moved carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision, but the ground was littered with debris, fallen branches, loose gravel, the remnants of a town that had been abandoned and left to rot. Every surface was a potential noise trap. Halfway through the 6th block, his boot caught the edge of a piece of sheet metal hidden in the grass. It scraped against the ground with a sharp metallic screech that cut through the moaning like a knife. Every ghoul within 30 yards turned toward the sound. Atticus froze. Gideon froze. Meat stood perfectly still, his boot still resting on the metal, his face locked in an expression that was equal parts frustration and concentration. The creatures closest to them swayed in place, their heads tilted, their mouths hanging open, listening, waiting for a second sound to confirm what they'd heard. The moaning around them shifted, rising slightly in pitch, an undercurrent of agitation rippling through the nearest zombies. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The seconds stretched out. 10, 20, 30. The nearest ghoul, a woman in a torn housecoat standing about 15 feet to their left, took a step toward them. Then another. Then it stopped, its head turning slowly, scanning the area with those vacant dead eyes. Atticus's hand was on his knife. Gideon's fingers were white on the handle of his sword. Meat's jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The creature in the housecoat stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then it turned away, resuming its aimless shuffle down the side yard, the momentary interest already fading from whatever was left of its mind. The others followed suit, one by one, the agitation draining out of them as the silence held. The moaning settled back to its baseline. The moment passed. Meat lifted his boot off the metal with agonizing care and stepped clear. He looked at Atticus with an expression that said everything he couldn't say out loud. Atticus gave him a small nod. No harm done. Keep moving. They picked their way through the 6th block, then the 7th, following Madison's trail of kills through the tangle of houses and yards. The density was crushing now, ghouls visible in every direction, filling the spaces between buildings like water filling a basin. But Madison's path held, a thin thread of cleared ground winding through the worst of it, and they followed it south. 8 blocks from where they'd started, the house with the covered windows came into view. 2-story covered porch, dark fabric behind the upstairs glass. It sat on a lot surrounded by a wooden fence, the yard thick with overgrown grass. The ground floor was dark and still. The front door was closed, and between them and the house, the last 30 yards were crawling with zombies. Atticus studied the layout from behind a hedge at the edge of the adjacent property. The zombies in the yard and along the street numbered at least a dozen, shuffling in their slow loops, filling the space between his team and the front porch. Getting past them without being seen or heard was going to take everything they had. He looked at Gideon, then at Meat. Both of them looked back, steady and ready. They were close. Madison was on the other side of that door. All they had to do was cross 30 yards of dead ground. Chapter 9. The last 30 yards were the problem. Atticus crouched behind the hedge at the edge of the adjacent property and studied the ground between them and Madison's house. The yard was thick with overgrown grass, the wooden fence around the lot sagging in places but still mostly upright. The covered porch ran the width of the front, and the door was closed. Upstairs, the dark fabric behind the windows hadn't moved. A dozen ghouls occupied the space between them and the porch. Some were in the yard itself, shuffling through the grass in aimless loops. Others were on the street out front, drifting past in the slow current that ran through the whole town. 2 more stood near the detached garage at the back of the property, swaying in place like they'd forgotten how to walk. Getting through them without noise was going to be the hardest thing they'd done since entering the town. Every kill they'd made so far had been a one-on-one encounter with room to maneuver. This was different. The ghouls here were close together, close enough that dropping one might alert the next, and the next one after that. A chain reaction in this density would bring the whole block down on them before they reached the porch. Atticus was working through the approach in his head, trying to map a path through the gaps, when the sound came from behind them. A moan, close, too close. He turned and saw them. 3 zombies had come around the corner of the house they were using for cover, not 10 yards back. They'd come from the north, following the same route the trio had taken through the yards, and now they were standing in the open with their heads locked onto the 3 living people crouched behind the hedge. The first one let out a full moan, the sound rising from its throat and carrying across the quiet yards like a signal flare. The second one joined in. The third started forward, its arms reaching, its feet dragging through the grass. The moaning spread. The ghouls in Madison's yard turned. The ones on the street turned. Heads swiveled across the block as the sound rippled outward, creature after creature picking up the call and adding to it, the volume swelling in seconds from a low drone to something urgent and hungry. "We're blown," Gideon said. There was no stealth left to preserve. The 3 zombies behind them were closing, and every ghoul within earshot was now oriented toward their position. The slow current on the street had shifted, bodies turning and beginning to converge. More were emerging from between houses on the far side of the road, drawn by the rising chorus of moaning. "We have to move now!" Atticus yelled. They broke cover. Gideon went first, vaulting the hedge and crossing into Madison's yard at a dead sprint. A zombie in the grass turned toward him, and he took its head off without breaking stride, the blade sweeping through in a flat arc that sent the top of its skull spinning into the weeds. He kept moving, closing the distance to the house. Atticus was right behind him, knife in one hand, eyes scanning for anything that got between them and that front porch. A creature lunged from his left, stumbling out of the overgrown grass with its arms wide. He ducked under its reach, drove the knife into its temple as he passed, and ripped the blade free without stopping. Meat came through the hedge like a freight train. The branches snapped and scattered as he plowed through, the wrench already off his back and in his hands. The 3 zombies that had been following them were right on his heels. He spun, planted his feet, and swung the wrench in a devastating horizontal arc that caught the lead creature across the face. The skull caved in, and the body went sideways, crashing into the second one, entangling them both in the grass. The third kept coming, and Meat met it head-on, driving the wrench down in an overhead strike that split the ghoul's skull from crown to jaw. It dropped at his feet, and he stepped over it, turning back toward the house. 2 more came at him from the side yard before he'd taken 3 steps. He caught the first one with a short jab of the wrench handle to the face, snapping its head back, then followed through with a full swing that caved in the second one's temple. The bodies hit the grass, and he kept moving, his boots churning through the overgrown weeds as he fought his way toward the porch. The yard was coming alive. Ghouls converged from every direction, pouring in from the street, from the neighboring yards, from the gaps between houses. The moaning was deafening now, a roar of dead voices that filled the air and pressed in from all sides. The density that had been manageable in 1s and 2s was becoming a flood. Gideon reached the porch steps and turned to face the yard, his blade up. 2 zombies were pushing through a hole in the fence from the street side, dead flesh ripping off on a jagged piece of wood. Another one came around the corner of the house from the east, moving faster than the others, its legs still working well enough to close distance at a lurching jog. Gideon stepped off the porch to meet it, the sword coming down in a diagonal slash that opened the creature from shoulder to sternum. It collapsed in a heap, and he pivoted to face the next one. Atticus hit the porch and spun around. The yard was filling up. Zombies pushed through the fence on 3 sides, the old wood groaning and cracking under the weight of bodies pressing against it. The street beyond was a river of ghouls now, all of them moving toward the noise, a mass of stumbling, moaning dead that stretched as far as he could see in both directions. Meat was in the middle of the yard, swinging the wrench in wide arcs that cleared a circle around him. Every swing connected. A zombie's skull caved in from the left. A ghoul went down from a backhand strike that sent it pinwheeling into the grass. A creature grabbed his arm, and he shook it off like a dog shaking water, then brought the wrench down on its head with enough force to drive it into the ground. He was holding his own, but the numbers were building around him, and the circle was shrinking. "Meat! Get to the porch!" Atticus shouted. Meat heard him, but couldn't disengage cleanly. 3 ghouls were pressing in from the east side, and 2 more had gotten between him and the house. He kicked one in the chest, sending it staggering back into the others, and used the opening to bull forward, driving through the gap, with the wrench swinging in front of him like a battering ram. Atticus met 2 zombies at the porch steps. The first one reached the bottom step, and he kicked it square in the chest, sending it tumbling back into the yard, The second came from the side, rounding the porch railing with its hands grasping. He drove the knife into its eye socket, twisted, and shoved the body off the porch. They were running out of time. The yard was packed now, creatures closing from every direction, the fence collapsing in sections as the weight of the dead pushed through it. In another minute, the porch would be surrounded. In 2, they'd be overwhelmed. Atticus made the decision. He pulled the handgun from the holster at his back, raised it, and fired a single shot into the skull of a zombie that was climbing the porch steps. The crack of the gunshot split the air, louder than anything that had happened in Garden Plain in weeks. It echoed off the buildings and rolled across the town, sharp and unmistakable. Every creature in earshot flinched. The moaning surged. And somewhere upstairs, behind those dark fabric curtains, someone heard it. It was a gamble. The gunshot would bring every ghoul in a 3-block radius down on their position. But it would also let Madison know that someone was on her front porch, regardless of where she was in the house. It was loud enough to rise above the constant moaning that had undoubtedly caused her to tune everything out. Gideon was at the base of the porch, his sword a blur as he held the line. A zombie grabbed his arm and he spun, using the creature's own momentum to fling it into 2 others, all 3 of them going down in a tangle. He slashed across the nearest skull and kicked the pile of bodies off the steps. Meat reached the porch, bleeding from a scratch on his forearm, where a set of dead fingers had raked across his skin. He turned and swung the wrench into the face of a ghoul that was right behind him, the impact sending teeth and bone fragments scattering across the grass. He backed up the steps, the wrench cocked over his shoulder, ready for whatever came next. Atticus holstered the handgun and pulled his knife again. He stood at the top of the steps with Gideon on his left and Meat on his right, the 3 of them forming a line across the porch as the dead closed in from every direction. Ghouls stumbled up the steps, pressed in from the sides. The porch became a killing ground, blades and blunt force meeting dead flesh in a desperate grinding fight that had no end in sight. A ghoul grabbed Atticus by the wrist. He twisted free, reversed the knife, and put the blade through the top of its skull. Another one came right behind it, and he met it with a straight kick to the knee that buckled its leg, then drove the knife down into the back of its neck as it fell. Gideon had retreated to the porch itself, his back nearly against the front door, the katana working in tight, controlled arcs that dropped everything within reach. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a fingernail had caught him, the blood running into his left eye, but his hands were steady and his footwork was precise. Meat stood at the top of the steps and refused to give ground. Every zombie that reached him got the wrench. He swung it like he was driving fence posts, methodical and brutal, each impact a sickening crunch of metal on bone that dropped creatures where they stood. The bodies were piling up at the base of the steps, creating a barricade of the dead that the living dead had to climb over to reach him. But the numbers didn't stop. For every zombie that went down, 2 more pushed forward. The moaning was a physical force now, a wall of sound that made it hard to think. The porch was their island, and the yard was a sea of reaching hands and vacant eyes, and the sea was rising. Atticus risked a glance at the door behind them. Closed, locked, barricaded from the inside. If Madison hadn't heard the gunshot, or if she'd decided the risk of opening that door was too great, then this porch was where it ended. 3 men with blades and a wrench against a town full of the dead. And the dead had all the time in the world. A creature got past Gideon's blade and grabbed the collar of Atticus's shirt, pulling him forward. He drove the knife up under its chin and shoved the body sideways, but another one was already reaching over the railing behind him. Gideon spun and took its arm off at the elbow, then reversed the blade and split its skull. They were out of room, out of time. The creatures were on the steps, on the railing, pressing against the porch from 3 sides. Meat was swinging the wrench with everything he had, each blow dropping a zombie, but his breathing was ragged and the swings were getting shorter. Then the door opened behind them. The sound of the deadbolt retracting was lost in the moaning, but Atticus heard the creak of the hinges and spun toward it. The door swung inward and a figure stood in the dark hallway, a handgun up in a 2-handed grip, the barrel sweeping past Atticus and locking onto the yard beyond. Madison opened fire. She put 3 rounds into the creatures closest to the porch in rapid succession, each shot a clean headshot that dropped its target where it stood. The gunfire cracked across the yard, sharp and precise, punching holes in the advancing wall of zombies. "Inside!" She shouted, "Move!" Meat went first, ducking through the doorway and clearing the hall. Gideon backed through next, his katana still up, dropping one last creature that tried to follow him through the door. Atticus was last. He stood in the doorway for a half-second, his knife dripping, his chest heaving, looking out at the yard full of ghouls pressing toward the porch. Then he stepped back, and Madison slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt and dropping a heavy wooden beam across the brackets. Something hit the door from the outside, then something else. The pounding started, fists and bodies slamming against the wood, the moaning rising to a fever pitch on the other side. The door shuddered in its frame, but held. Madison stepped back from the door, her handgun still raised, her eyes locked on the wood as it shook with each impact. She stood there for a long moment, controlled and still, waiting to see if the barricade would hold. It held. She lowered the gun and turned to face the three men standing in her hallway. Her eyes moved from Meat to Gideon, sizing them up in a single glance, and then settled on Atticus. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression clearly displeased. "You're late." Chapter 10. The pounding on the front door continued, a steady rhythm of dead fists and dead weight slamming against the wood. The beam across the brackets held, and the deadbolt held, and after a while the impacts started to taper off. Not because the ghouls were giving up, but because they were spreading out, losing focus, their attention scattering the way it always did when the stimulus stopped. Madison kept her handgun trained on the door until the pounding faded to an occasional thud. Then she lowered it and turned to face the three men standing in her hallway. She looked the way Atticus remembered her, but harder, thinner. Her short black hair was unwashed and pushed back from her face, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many nights with not enough sleep. Her clothes were practical, dark pants and a fitted long-sleeve shirt, both stained and worn. A sheath on her belt held the knife he'd seen evidence of all through town. The handgun she carried was well-maintained, the grip worn smooth from use. She was tired, but her eyes were sharp, and the way she held herself said that tired didn't mean soft. Her gaze moved from Atticus to Meat, sizing up the enormous man filling her hallway, then settled on Gideon. She stared at him for a long moment. He was covered in creature blood from the fight in the yard, his katana still in his hand, dark streaks running down his arms and splattered across his chest. "I have a lot of questions," Madison said, "but I'm going to start with, why is there a blood-soaked ninja standing in my house?" Atticus smirked before responding. "Times are tough, and when you're putting together a crew and can't pull from the military, you got to get a little creative." Gideon looked down at himself, then back at her. "The Ninja Dominator, at your service, ma'am." The corner of Madison's mouth twitched, but she didn't smile. She looked back at Atticus, and the brief flicker of amusement drained from her expression. "You said you'd be back soon." "I know," Atticus said. "It's been weeks." "I know that too." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and he could see the anger sitting right behind the composure. Not rage, nothing uncontrolled, but a slow burn that had been building every day he hadn't shown up. She'd been out here alone, surviving on skill and stubbornness, waiting for help that took its time arriving. She let out a breath through her nose and holstered the handgun. "We should get upstairs. The ground floor isn't secure enough to stay in for long." She led them through the house. The ground floor was stripped down, the furniture pushed against the walls, and the windows covered, not barricaded from the outside, but concealed. Dark fabric hung over every window, blocking the view in and the light out. The doors were all reinforced, the front door with the beam and deadbolt, the back door with a similar setup. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the gaps between the fabric and the window frames. The stairs creaked under Meat's weight as they climbed to the second floor. The upstairs was where Madison had been living. A sleeping bag was laid out on the floor of the main bedroom, positioned away from the windows, but close enough to reach them quickly. Water bottles lined one wall, a couple dozen of them, some full, some empty. A small cache of weapons sat in the corner. A second handgun, 2 boxes of ammunition, and a collection of knives in various sizes. Next to the weapons, a notebook sat open with dense handwriting covering the pages. The room at the end of the hall had been set up as an observation post. The windows on 3 sides were covered with the same dark fabric, but each one had a small slit cut at eye level, just wide enough to look through without being seen from the street. From here, Madison could watch the roads to the north, south, and east without exposing herself. "You've been busy," Atticus said, looking around. "Staying alive is a full-time job in this town." She moved to the observation room and checked each window slit before turning back to them. "The gunfire is going to bring more of them into the neighborhood. They'll pack in tight for a while, then spread out again once the noise fades from whatever passes for their memory. We should be fine up here as long as we keep quiet." She leaned against the wall and crossed her arms, looking at Atticus. "All right, talk, starting with why it took you weeks to get here." "Things have been messy in the region," Atticus said. "Militia activity, supply line problems, a lot of fires that needed putting out before Clint and Gadd could spare the people to send us back. It wasn't for lack of wanting to get here sooner." Madison took that in, her expression unchanged. She'd been operating in the dark for weeks. No communications, no updates, no way of knowing what was happening beyond what she could see from these windows. Learning that the situation outside Kansas had its own complications didn't soften the frustration, but it explained the silence. "I saw what happened to Grand Bend," she said. "From a distance. I was on my way back when the trucks rolled in. I could hear the gunfire and see the vehicles from a couple of miles out. I knew better than to go back." "That was the right call," Atticus said. "I know it was." There was no uncertainty in her voice. "What about the safe house?" "Destroyed. They kicked in the door and tore the place apart, ransacked everything, took what they wanted, smashed the rest. By the time we got there, there was nothing left." She closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, the anger was there again, hotter this time, but she kept it leashed. "Most of what I had on Bennett's operation was in there, not to mention the arsenal. I'm not going to lie, that hurts to lose." "I'm sorry," Atticus said. "It was already done before we arrived." "Survivors?" she asked. "Max. He hid in a concealed closet during the raid. We found him and got him out. He's with the rest of my team heading to a farm near Ellsworth." Madison's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Max. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. She didn't dwell on it. "What team?" Atticus nodded toward Gideon and Meat. "These two, plus a biker crew led by a man named Buck, and a private named Ingrid who handles our radio communications. Clint and Gadd sent us from Seattle." Madison looked at Gideon again, then at Meat. She was reading them the way a trained operative reads people, quick assessments based on posture, condition, gear, and how they carried themselves. Gideon stood relaxed but alert, his katana cleaned and back in position, his breathing already settled from the fight. Meat leaned against the doorframe, with his wrench resting on his shoulder, blood on his forearm from the scratch he'd taken in the yard, but otherwise solid. "The ninja I can see," Madison said. "What about the big one?" "Meat," Meat said. "And I'm a lot more useful than I look." "Meat? As in greet or a slab of beef?" Madison asked. Meat smirked, flexing his arm for a moment before responding. "Definitely the slab of beef." Madison sighed as she uncrossed her arms and moved to the window, checking the street through the slit. The moaning outside was still elevated, the ghouls agitated from the gunfire, but the pitch was starting to settle. Madison uncrossed her arms and moved to the window, checking the street through the slit. The moaning outside was still elevated, the ghouls agitated from the gunfire, but the pitch was starting to settle. "When I came to Garden Plain, the town was mostly empty," she said, still looking through the slit. "A few zombies wandering through, nothing I couldn't handle. I set up here, cleared the ones closest to the house, started building a perimeter." She paused. Then a convoy came through. Military vehicles, heavy trucks, heading north, away from Wichita, on the highway just east of town. They weren't looking for me. They were just passing through on their way to whatever Bennett has them doing near the city. She turned from the window. But the noise from the convoy drew every ghoul within miles. They came in from the fields, from the roads, from everywhere. By the next morning, the town was packed. What took me days to clear was undone in a single night. "We found the checkpoint they set up on a side road north of here," Atticus said. "Sawhorses, sandbags, shell casings, fresh." Madison nodded. "They've been running operations in the area for a while now. I've watched patrols on the highway from up here, trucks moving back and forth between the city and whatever staging areas they've got set up to the east. It's regular, scheduled. Every couple of days, vehicles come through. Bennett's scouting Wichita, Atticus said. He's doing more than scouting. He's mapping it. Entry points, weak spots in the old military barriers, zombie concentrations inside the perimeter. Whatever he's planning for that city, he's getting close to pulling the trigger. The room was quiet for a moment. The moaning outside filled the silence, that constant backdrop that had been with them since they entered the town. "What about Connie?" Atticus asked. Max said the soldiers took her separately from the others, singled her out. Madison moved to her sleeping area and sat down on the edge of the sleeping bag, her back against the wall. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that builds up over weeks of running on discipline alone. Burlington is Bennett's seat of power. He keeps the people he considers valuable close. If they singled Connie out, it's because they know who she is and what she can do. She's not just another survivor to them. "So she's alive," Gideon said. "If Bennett thinks she's useful, she's alive. He doesn't throw away assets." Meat spoke up from the doorway. "What about the people from Grand Bend who weren't singled out? Where did they go?" "Hard to say without more information," Madison said. "Bennett's operation has been spreading across the state. He's got work camps, labor details, settlements where civilians are put to use. The people from Grand Bend could be at any one of them." She reached for her notebook and opened it to a page filled with dates, times, and directional arrows. "I've been tracking what I can see from here. Patrol patterns, convoy schedules, troop movements on the highways. It's not much, but it's something." Atticus looked at the notebook. The handwriting was small and precise. Every entry organized by date, with notes on vehicle types, direction of travel, and estimated numbers. She'd been doing intelligence work with nothing but a window and a pen, and doing it well. "This is why we came to find you," he said. "Without your intelligence, we're walking blind." "You were walking blind anyway," Madison said. "You just didn't know it." She closed the notebook and set it beside her. The exhaustion showed in her face, the weight of weeks alone in a town full of the dead, catching up with her, now that there were other people in the room. People she didn't have to hide from. "I've also got a contact inside Bennett's organization," she said. "Sergeant Cook. He's been feeding me information when he can, through dead drops and coded messages. He's the reason I know as much as I do about what Bennett's been building. Cook's the key to any move we make against Burlington." "Is Cook safe?" Atticus asked. "As safe as anyone can be when they're spying on a man like Bennett. He's careful and he's smart, but every day he's in there is another day he might get caught." Atticus filed that away. Cook was an asset they couldn't afford to lose, and one they couldn't do much to protect from this distance. Madison looked at the three of them, her expression settling into something that was less guarded than it had been when they first walked in. Not warm, not yet, but the wall had come down a few inches. These were people who had fought through a town full of zombies to find her. That counted for something. "So what's the plan?" she asked. "You didn't come all this way just to check on me." "We regroup," Atticus said. "Get to the farm near Ellsworth, link up with Buck's group, and figure out our next move with the full picture in front of us. Your intel, Cook's information, whatever Max and the others have put together while we've been gone. And Connie, we get her back, but we do it smart, not fast." Madison studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "We might as well get a bite to eat and get some rest." She glanced toward the windows. "We're not going anywhere for a while. The gunfire riled them up, and they'll be thick around this block for a while." "How long?" Gideon asked. "A few hours. They'll pack in, wander around, and eventually drift back to wherever they came from. We move when it thins out." She stood up, the exhaustion still visible, but something else there now too. Purpose. Direction. She'd been surviving for weeks with no clear picture of what came next, running on training and instinct and the stubbornness to keep going when there was no reason to believe help was coming. Now there was a plan, or at least the beginning of one, and Atticus could see her shifting gears from survival mode into something sharper. "A few hours," Atticus said. "We can work with that." He looked at Gideon and Meat. Both of them were settling in, Gideon cleaning his blade with a rag from his pack, Meat inspecting the scratch on his forearm. They were banged up, tired, and sitting in a house surrounded by creatures, but they were alive, and they'd found what they came for. Madison moved to the observation post and took her position at the window, her eyes scanning the streets below. She was already working, already watching, the notebook open on the sill beside her. The four of them waited while the dead milled outside, filling the streets and yards with their constant, aimless wandering. The moaning rose and fell in slow waves, and somewhere in the distance, more ghouls were still making their way toward the gunfire they had heard. But inside the house, behind the covered windows and the barricaded doors, the mission had changed. They weren't searching anymore. They'd found her. Now they had to get out. Chapter 11. Madison pulled a small cardboard box from under her sleeping bag and set it on the floor between them. Inside were 3 alarm clocks and 2 cell phones, all battery-powered, all functional. "I've been saving these for when I needed to move through the town," she said. "Set the alarm, plant it somewhere a few blocks away, and when it goes off, the sound draws them toward it and away from wherever you're trying to go." Gideon picked up one of the alarm clocks and turned it over in his hands. It was a cheap wind-up model, the kind you'd find on a nightstand in any bedroom in America. Nothing special about it except that, in a town full of creatures that hunted by sound, it was as good as a grenade. "How long does the alarm run before it winds down?" he asked. "Couple of minutes on the clocks. The phones will ring until the battery dies, which could be a while." Madison glanced toward the window. "The neighborhood is still packed from the gunfire. If we're going to leave before dark, we need to thin them out. Plant these in a spread pattern north and east of the house, and the noise should pull them away from our exit route to the south." Atticus looked at Gideon and Meat. "You two up for it?" Gideon was already on his feet, sliding the sword into the scabbard on his back. "Give us 15 minutes on the timers. That should be enough time to get them placed and get back." Meat stood up, which in the low-ceilinged upstairs room meant he had to hunch. He picked up the 2 cell phones and one of the alarm clocks, while Gideon took the remaining 2 clocks. They divided them into packs and pockets, keeping their hands free. Madison showed them the back door on the ground floor, the same one she used for her own movements through the town. It opened into a narrow gap between the house and the fence, shielded from the street by the detached garage. She'd kept the path between the door and the garage clear of ghouls as part of her daily routine, and for the moment, it was still open. "Stay off the main road," she said. "Work through the backyards and alleys. Plant the devices at least 2 blocks out and spread them wide. The more ground the sound covers, the bigger the gap they'll create." Gideon nodded. Meat adjusted the wrench across his back and gave Atticus a look that said he'd rather be doing this than sitting around. "Be smart," Atticus said. "Get in, plant them, get back. No heroics." "No promises," Meat said, and ducked through the back door into the gap. Gideon followed him out, and Madison closed and barricaded the door behind them. The alley behind the garage was clear. Meat pressed his back against the wooden fence and scanned the adjacent yard, while Gideon moved to the corner and checked the cross street. 2 zombies were visible on the road, both facing away, shuffling south toward the front of the house where the earlier gunfire had drawn the heaviest concentration. Gideon motioned Meat forward, and they slipped across the street between the 2 ghouls, neither of which turned. They were in the next block within seconds, moving through a side yard littered with fallen branches and an overturned wheelbarrow. The plan was simple. Gideon would take the 2 alarm clocks north, planting one at 2 blocks out and the other at 3. Meat would take the phones and the remaining clock east, spreading them across a similar distance. They'd set 15 minutes on everything and be back at the house before the first alarm sounded. They split at the corner of a brick ranch house, Gideon going left and Meat going right. Gideon moved fast, staying low, his katana in his right hand and the alarm clocks tucked under his left arm. The backyards on this block were fenced, and he used the gates to move between properties, easing each one open and checking the other side before stepping through. A creature stood in the 3rd yard, its back to him, swaying next to a rusted swing set. Gideon closed the distance in 3 quick strides, the katana coming up in a short arc that split the base of its skull. The ghoul dropped without a sound, folding onto the patchy grass beside the swing set. He kept moving. The next yard was empty, and the one after that had 2 zombies standing near the back door of the house. One was facing his direction. It spotted him and opened its mouth, the beginning of a moan rising in its throat. Gideon didn't slow down. He covered the ground between them before the sound could fully form, the blade catching the first one across the temple, and the follow-through taking the second one in the side of the head. Both went down in the same motion, a single fluid strike that looked rehearsed, but wasn't. 2 blocks north. He found a spot behind a garden shed, tucked the first alarm clock under the shed's foundation where it wouldn't be visible, and set the timer. 15 minutes. The clock started ticking, the tiny mechanical sound inaudible beyond a few inches. In 15 minutes, it would be anything but. He pushed on to the 3rd block, planting the 2nd clock inside an open garage, wedged behind a stack of paint cans. Another 15-minute timer. He checked the street from the garage door. Creatures milled about in the road, a dozen or more visible in both directions, but none were close enough to be a problem. He turned back south and started working his way home. Meat had his own problems. The eastern route was denser than Gideon's. The blocks between Madison's house and the main road had more ghouls packed into them, drawn by the gunfire that had come from the front of the house. Meat moved through the backyards with his knife in one hand and the devices tucked into his jacket, the wrench strapped across his back for emergencies. He made it through the 1st block without contact, but the 2nd block put him face to face with a creature standing in a gate he needed to pass through. It spotted him. At the same time, he spotted it. No room to go around, no time to wait. Meat stepped forward and drove the knife into the zombie's forehead with a straight punch that had his full weight behind it. The blade sank to the hilt and the creature went limp, its body dropping straight down and blocking the gate. He pulled the knife free, grabbed the ghoul by the collar, and dragged it aside, clearing the path. 2 more were in the next yard, standing near a collapsed section of fence. One turned toward him as he came through the gate. He grabbed it by the throat, drove the knife through its temple, and shoved the body into the 2nd one, knocking it off balance. Before it could recover, he stepped over the first body and put the blade through the top of its skull. He planted the first cell phone on the porch of a house 2 blocks east, tucking it behind a planter where the creatures wouldn't accidentally knock it off. He set the alarm for 15 minutes and moved on. The 2nd phone went into an open car parked on a side street, placed on the dashboard where the sound would carry through the broken windshield. The last alarm clock he wedged into the gap between a fence post and a mailbox at the corner of the 3rd block. All timers set, all devices planted. He turned back west and started the return trip, his knife dripping and his breathing heavy but controlled. He ran into trouble on the last block. 4 zombies had gathered in the alley he needed to cross, standing in a loose cluster near a dumpster. They spotted him as he came around the corner, and all 4 started forward at once. Meat didn't have room to be subtle. He pulled the wrench off his back and met the first one with a full swing that caved in the side of its skull and sent the body spinning into the fence. The 2nd one grabbed his jacket and he shrugged it off the shoulder, pivoting to bring the wrench around in a backhand strike that connected with the creature's jaw. It went down hard. The 3rd caught the wrench on an upswing that lifted it off its feet before it crumpled to the pavement. The 4th ghoul lunged at him from the side. He caught it with his free hand, held it at arm's length, and drove the wrench into the top of its head with a short, controlled strike. The skull cracked, and the body went limp. 4 down. The noise hadn't been quiet, but it hadn't been a gunshot either. He wiped the wrench on his jeans and moved fast, crossing the last stretch of backyards and slipping through the gap beside Madison's garage, reaching the door and going in. Gideon was already there, cleaning his blade in the hallway. He looked up as Meat came through the door. "Any trouble?" Gideon asked. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Meat said. While Gideon and Meat were out, Atticus and Madison sat in the observation room upstairs. The moaning outside was still heavy, but the worst of the agitation from the gunfire had started to settle. Through the slits in the window coverings, Atticus could see ghouls packed into the street below, dozens of them, but their movement had slowed from convergence back to aimless wandering. "How much do you know about what Bennett's been building out here?" Madison asked. "I read your reports before we left Seattle," Atticus said. "Rothman, the takeover, Bennett positioning himself as the liberator. I know how he got started. What I don't know is how far it's gone since then." Madison looked at him with something close to approval. At least he'd done his homework. "Then you know the foundation. What's changed is the scale." She flipped a page in her notebook. When those reports were written, Bennett controlled a handful of towns and had a few hundred soldiers. Now he's got the major towns across central and eastern Kansas locked down. Not just soldiers anymore. Armed civilians, supply networks, structured patrols running between strongholds on a regular schedule. It's a functioning military operation with a real civilian support base. How many people are we talking about? Thousands. Between his soldiers, the civilians who joined willingly, and the ones who joined because they didn't have a choice, he's built something that looks a lot like a small country. He's smart enough to give people just enough freedom to keep them compliant. Food, shelter, protection from the zombies. In exchange, you follow his rules, you work where he tells you to work, and you don't ask questions. And if you do ask questions, you end up in a work camp, or worse. He's got labor details all over the state. Farms, supply depots, construction projects. The people from Grand Bend are probably at one of them right now. Atticus thought about the people Max had described, rounded up by soldiers and loaded onto trucks, taken somewhere to serve Bennett's growing operation, whether they wanted to or not. The Bennett he'd read about in those files had been ambitious. This version was something else entirely. "What about Wichita?" he asked. Madison's expression sharpened. "That's the part that keeps me up at night. Bennett's been mapping the city's fortifications for weeks. Entry points, barrier conditions, creature concentrations inside the perimeter. He's not studying it out of curiosity. He's building a playbook. For controlling the release," Atticus said. It wasn't a question. He'd been putting the pieces together since the checkpoint on the side road. Madison nodded. "The old military barriers around Wichita are still mostly intact. They were designed to keep the zombie population contained, and they've held up. But they have weak points, sections that have degraded, gates that could be opened. If Bennett figures out how to open those barriers selectively, he can direct the flow, point the ghouls in whatever direction he wants. Any community that resists, he doesn't need to send soldiers. He just opens a gate." "Now you see the problem," Madison said. "He's already got an army and a population that's either loyal or afraid. If he adds Wichita to his arsenal, there's nobody left in Kansas who can stand against him." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the moaning outside. Atticus sat with the weight of it, turning the pieces over in his head. The man he'd read about in those reports had been dangerous. The man Madison was describing was something closer to untouchable. "Cook's been feeding you all of this?" Atticus asked. "Cook and what I've been able to observe myself. He's the one who confirmed the Wichita operations. Without him, I'd only have half the picture." From downstairs, the sound of the back door opening and closing reached them, followed by footsteps and the low murmur of Gideon and Meat's voices. They were back. Madison closed the notebook. "Looks like your boys are back. We should go get ready to move." Atticus stood and offered her a hand. She took it, pulling herself up, and for a second the exhaustion showed in full. The dark circles, the thinness in her face, the slight tremor in her grip that came from too many days running on discipline instead of rest. Then it was gone, tucked away behind the same composure she'd been wearing since she opened that door. "Let's go get your team." Chapter 12. The first alarm went off 2 blocks north. It was a sharp, insistent ringing that cut through the moaning like a blade, mechanical and relentless. Through the slit in the observation room window, Atticus watched the effect ripple through the ghouls on the street below. Heads turned, bodies pivoted. The aimless wandering shifted into something with direction as the creatures nearest to the sound began shuffling toward it, drawn by the ringing the way they were drawn to any noise that didn't sound like them. 30 seconds later, a second alarm sounded from the east, then a third, further north. Then the tinny electronic ring of a cell phone joined the chorus from somewhere beyond the main road. The effect was dramatic. The zombies that had been packed into the neighborhood since the gunfire started moving in waves, pulling away from the house and toward the scattered noise sources. The street below went from crowded to thin in under a minute. Not empty, not by a long shot, but manageable. Gaps opened between the remaining creatures, spaces wide enough to move through. "Let's get moving," Madison said. She was already packed. The notebook went into a small backpack along with her ammunition, a water bottle, and the second handgun. The knives stayed on her belt. She moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment, checking each window one last time before heading downstairs. Atticus caught up with Gideon and Meat in the hallway and gave them the short version of what Madison had shared about Bennett's expansion and Wichita. He kept it to a few sentences. The details could wait for the farm. What mattered now was that they understood the scope of what they were dealing with. "So it's worse than we thought," Gideon said. Considerably. Meat adjusted the wrench across his back. Then, we better get moving. They exited through the back door, the same way Gideon and Meat had gone out to plant the alarms. The gap between the house and the garage was clear, and the alley beyond it was nearly empty. The alarm clocks were doing their work, the ringing still audible from multiple directions, pulling the creatures away from the south side of town. Madison moved differently than the other three. Atticus noticed it within the first 30 seconds. She didn't move like someone who was careful. She moved like someone who belonged here. Her footsteps fell in the gaps between the moaning, her body angled through tight spaces without brushing the fences or walls on either side. Her eyes tracked the ghouls around them with a familiarity that came from weeks of doing exactly this. She'd been navigating this town alone, in the dark, surrounded by the dead, and it showed in every step. Gideon noticed it too. He watched her clear a corner with a quick glance and a smooth pivot that mirrored his own movement, and gave Atticus a look that said he was impressed. They moved through the blocks in the same formation they'd used coming in, Atticus on point, Gideon covering the left, Meat in the rear. Madison slotted in between Gideon and Meat without being told, filling the gap naturally, her knife in her hand and her eyes moving in steady arcs. The alarm clocks were fading. The cheap wind-up mechanisms were running down, the ringing growing weaker, and the creatures that had been drawn to them would start drifting back soon. But the cell phones were still going, their electronic ringtones carrying across the rooftops from the east side of town, buying the group more time. They made it through 4 blocks without contact. The 5th block put a zombie in their path, standing in a gate they needed to pass through. Madison was closest. She stepped forward, caught it by the shoulder, and drove her knife into the base of its skull with a short, precise thrust. The ghoul dropped, and she stepped over it without breaking stride. The 6th block was tighter. The alarms were dying, and the creatures were starting to drift back, the gaps in the streets narrowing as zombies filtered in from the north and east. Atticus adjusted their route on the fly, cutting through a backyard he hadn't used on the way in, squeezing between a garden shed and a fence to avoid a cluster of 4 ghouls that had gathered at an intersection ahead. Madison kept pace without hesitation, reading his adjustments and adapting to them like she'd been part of the team for months instead of minutes. At one point, she tapped Gideon's shoulder and pointed to a zombie approaching from their blind side, a ghoul that had come around the corner of a house without any of them noticing. Gideon dispatched it with a quick thrust and gave her a nod of thanks. Meat watched from behind and leaned toward Gideon. "She's scary," he whispered. Gideon nodded. "Good scary." The north edge of town came into view as they cleared the last residential block. The open field stretched out ahead of them, the same flat, dry landscape they had crossed on the way in. Creatures were visible in the grass, scattered across the terrain in the same density they had encountered before, but the concentrated mass of the town was behind them now. The moaning faded as they put distance between themselves and the buildings, replaced by the wind and the soft rustle of dead grass underfoot. They crossed the irrigation ditch that had carried them in and pushed north through the fields, retracing their route toward the stash point. The going was faster this time. They knew the terrain, they knew the rhythm, and they had a 4th set of eyes watching for trouble. Madison kept pace without effort, her breathing steady, her movements fluid even after weeks of running on too little food and too little sleep. A pair of zombies appeared in their path near a collapsed fence line, both of them standing motionless in the grass. Atticus and Gideon took one each, quick blade work from both sides that put them down without slowing the group's pace. Further on, a lone creature shuffled out of a drainage ditch ahead of them, the same kind of ditch that had hidden a ghoul on the way south. This time, Meat was ready. He stepped forward and put his knife through its temple before it could moan. They settled back into the move-watch-kill rhythm that had carried them south, but it felt different with 4, tighter, more complete. Madison filled a gap they hadn't realized was there until it was filled. The farmstead appeared on the horizon after about an hour of walking, the peaked roof of the barn visible above the tree line. Atticus felt something loosen in his chest at the sight of it. The barn was still standing, the doors still closed, the beams still in place. No creatures had gotten in. They cleared the property of a handful of zombies that had wandered into the yard since they had left. Quick and quiet work that the 4 of them handled without needing to coordinate. Meat lifted the beam on the barn doors, and Atticus pulled them open. The SUV sat inside, untouched, right where they'd left it. "Beautiful sight," Meat said. They loaded up fast. Madison's pack went in the back alongside the supply containers and the fuel they'd scavenged. Atticus did a quick check of the vehicle, tires, engine, fuel level, and found everything intact. He climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. The sound of it rumbling to life felt different than it had on the way down, louder, more exposed. But they were headed north now, away from Wichita and its shadow, and every mile would thin the density around them. Gideon took the passenger seat. Meat and Madison climbed into the back, Meat taking his usual position with his knees jammed against the seat in front of him, and Madison settling in beside him with her notebook already open on her lap. "You gonna read that the whole way?" Meat asked. "Probably," Madison said without looking up. "I've got patrol schedules that might need updating depending on what we've seen on the road. If Bennett's people are running checkpoints this far south, the patterns I've been tracking could be shifting." "She's going to fit right in," Gideon said from the front. Atticus pulled the SUV out of the barn and onto the dirt path leading back to the highway. Meat got out to close the barn doors behind them, a small gesture that said they might need this place again, then jogged back to the vehicle and squeezed into the back seat. They hit the highway and turned north. The ghouls on the road were still there, scattered across the lanes and the shoulders, but the density was lighter than what they'd driven through on the way south. The creatures had drifted, spread by time, and the absence of any sustained noise to draw them together. Atticus wove through them at a steady pace, the SUV rolling past the shambling figures without stopping. They passed the checkpoint on the side road where they'd found Bennett's operation. The sawhorses and sandbags were still there, undisturbed, no new vehicles, no fresh tracks. Atticus glanced at it as they passed and kept driving. The gas station where they'd fueled up came and went, the bodies of the 7 zombies from the fight still lying in the lot where they'd fallen. The small towns they'd driven through on the way down scrolled past in reverse, the same empty buildings and wandering dead. The same flat silence broken only by the engine and the moaning that drifted in from the fields. Nobody spoke for a while. The adrenaline from the town was fading, replaced by the quiet weight of everything they'd learned and everything that still lay ahead. It was a lot, more than Atticus had expected when they'd left Grand Bend, and more than Clint and Gad had expected when they'd sent him back to Kansas. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission anymore. It hadn't been one since they'd found Max in that closet. It was something bigger, something that was going to require more than a small team and a single cruise missile to resolve. But they had pieces now, real intelligence, a map of what Bennett had built, where his people operated, and what he was planning. They had Madison, who could read that map better than anyone else alive. They had Cook, a man on the inside who could open doors that would stay locked to anyone approaching from the outside. And they had a team waiting for them at a farm near Ellsworth, people who had already proven they could fight. Madison turned a page in her notebook, her pen moving in quick strokes as she annotated something in the margin. Meat had his head back against the seat, his eyes closed but not sleeping, just resting, conserving energy the way a man his size had learned to do. Gideon watched the road ahead, his katana case between his knees, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. They weren't 3 people looking for answers anymore. They were 4 people with the beginnings of a plan, headed north toward the rest of their team, carrying the weight of what was coming and the knowledge of what needed to be done. The flat Kansas landscape stretched out in front of them, and for the first time since they had arrived, Atticus felt something he hadn't felt in days. Direction. Gideon seemed to sense the shift. He glanced at Atticus and raised an eyebrow. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" "The look that says you're already planning 3 moves ahead." Atticus adjusted his hat and settled his hands on the wheel. "Nah, only 2, he said with a smirk. The SUV rolled north through the empty Kansas countryside, the shadow of Wichita fading in the mirror behind them, and the road ahead stretching toward whatever came next. The end.